The Wars of the Diadochi were a long period of successive and destructive wars in Greece and the Middle East over the ruins of Alexander's empire. His generals, the Diadochi, and their sons, the Epigoni, fought tooth and nail with horizon-spanning armies to secure as much of his empire as they could, with the help of both Greek and barbarian troops. In our series, we have tried to cover as much of the wars as possible, but there are more stories to tell. In this long-form video, we will try to fill in the gaps and discuss lesser-known details of the wars, such as the Nabatean confrontations and the Celtic invasions of Greece. We will also more extensively discuss the aftermath of the Syrian Wars between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties. As this epic showdown unfolds with this new information, we will provide more entertaining and informative content while also correcting any mistakes in our shorter videos. Welcome to our overview of the Wars of the Diadochi, their epic battles, and the birth of the Hellenistic Age. Before getting into our long story, we must first discuss our primary sources. Like the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars, most of our information on the Diadochi Wars comes from one ancient writer, Diodorus Sikellos. Diodorus Sikellos was from Sicily and lived in the 1st century BCE. His Bibliotheca Historica is a significant work of universal history, from mythic times to the start of the Gallic Wars. There are issues with his work, such as unreliable sourcing, but modern scholars generally consider his work on the Diadochi to be useful. In addition to Diodorus, the Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote some stories relevant to the Diadochi Wars. Other ancient sources, such as the Roman historian Justin or surviving inscriptions on Babylonian cuneiform tablets, have allowed scholars to construct a rough chronology of the significant events of the Hellenistic era. Another thing to consider is the nature of the Macedonian or Hellenistic monarchies, who acted as the main drivers of these conflicts. Macedonian kingship revolved around delegating duties from the king to his companions, or fili, friends who grew up and fought alongside him. In addition, military values dominated Macedonian life. Thus, when Macedonian kings ended up ruling over lands of incredible wealth, like Persia, people who felt they had a noble right to rule due to Macedonian courtly values ended up clashing with other generals of less noble birth who had invested in fighting with Alexander. The various parts of the empire the Diadochi ended up ruling had their own traditions and social structures, and this impacted how each Epigonos acted. Hellenistic kingship emulated Alexander for legitimacy, at least in the early period, and this appeal to continuity is a key issue for the wars. The Diadochi used these militaristic values to assert control in their courts and form government structures on top of the existing local ones. After an initial morning shock, the Diadochi met before an assembly of their soldiers in front of Alexander's empty throne in the Partition of Babylon, called by Perdiccas, the man who now served as temporary regent over Alexander's empire. Perdiccas, the son of a noble Macedonian family from Orestis, had placed the diadem, ring, cuirass and robe on the throne, and said that they had to choose a new leader. This immediately divided the room, as the Diadochi all had different ideas as to who that leader should be. One proposal by Nearchos, the man who had sailed from India back to Persia, was to crown Heracles, the son of Alexander and Barsine. Another choice was to wait and see if Roshenak's child would be a boy, and let him rule. Ptolemy, who had served alongside Alexander, instead proposed a rule by council. This was partially due to xenophobia, as unlike Alexander's pragmatic and ambitious policy of accommodating Persian and Greek customs into one universal monarchy, most of the Diadochi did not want to be ruled by half-Persian emperors. Ultimately, no consensus could be found, and soon conflict erupted. Meleager, an experienced general who fought against the Getae, said that this entire council was all a master plan by Perdiccas because no matter which child ruled, he would be its guardian, and thus the de facto king. In typical Greek soap opera fashion, one random soldier in the background shouted that Alexander's half-brother, Arrhidaeus, was already here and could rule. Despite objections being raised that Arrhidaeus had some sort of mental disability that allowed him to function but made him prone to bouts of instability, many soldiers agreed he should rule. Two factions formed. one of mostly generals siding with Perdiccas, and one of mostly soldiers with Arrhidaeus. Meleager, under unclear circumstances, ended up joining the second faction, and gained so much support that Perdiccas was forced to call for help from the Persian Epigoni, the Persian nobles who had sided with Alexander. A stalemate developed, and the next day, Meleager assembled the mutineers to find and arrest Perdiccas. The faction that had sided with Perdiccas got Eumenes, the secretary who had served under both Philip and Alexander, and thus was respected by the common phalanx soldier, to try to calm the troops. He did so by agreeing to a co-regency of Arrhidaeus' and Roshenak's child, if it was a boy. The next day, a purification ceremony was called, but where the soldiers expected reconciliation, they got revenge. As the two sides embraced, the Persians arrested 300 seditionists. Meleager, who realized that the generals had set up a trap, fled to a temple but ended up surrendering to the Perdican faction and was murdered. This would be the first of many such backstabs. The council that resumed afterwards had the following separation of courtly powers. Arrhidaeus, now Philip III, was now the king of the Macedonian Empire. Perdiccas was regent, Seleucus was companion commander, and Cassander was commander of the guard. Moreover, the massive realm Alexander had conquered was divided among the most influential of the Diadochi. Antipater got Illyria, Macedon, Epirus, and Greece. Lysimachus got Thrace, Leonatos got Hellespontine Phrygia, Antigonos got Greater Phrygia, Lycia and Pamphylia, Asander got Caria, Eumenes got Paphlagonia and Cappadocia, and Ptolemy was given Egypt. Many local Persians got satrapies as well, such as Atrapates, the satrap of Media, who had once fought against but then joined forces with Alexander. Moreover, many rulers in the east, like Oxyates, the father of Roshenak, or Porus, maintained local autonomy and retained control of their people. The agency of various local non-Greek leaders will become important in the ensuing wars and the Hellenistic period in general. Two major players were not in Babylon when all this was unfolding. These were Antipater, the elderly regent in Macedon, and Craterus, who had been dispatched alongside Leonatos to take the veterans who wished to return home to Macedon. It was then that simmering discontent in southern Greece, which was xenophobic towards Macedonians, erupted into outright revolt. Many city-states, especially Athens, did not like the idea of Macedonian pan-Hellenism, and this had increased after the exiles' decree of 324 BCE, forcing the Greek city-states to accept all their exiled citizens back and relinquish many of their colonies. In addition to all this, there was even a bill in the Agora to recognize Alexander as a god, which for Hellenes was seen as beyond the pale. After debates in the Agora, Athens declared war and instigated a revolt. A strategos named Leosthenes led the charge against Macedonian imperialism. Many other city-states in mainland Greece joined the revolt, especially those in Aetolia and the northern Peloponnesos. However, the revolt gained less popularity in the Aegean and in Sparta, which did not want to fight under Athenian command. Leosthenes secured mercenaries with Athenian money and was elected general of the Greeks. After a short and decisive victory against pro-Macedon forces in Plataea, the Athenian strategos went to the famous site of Thermopylae to face down the Macedonian general Antipater, who had amassed 13,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry to put down the southern Hellenes' revolt. We do not know much about this battle, but we know that the Thessalian cavalry betrayed the Macedonians and ravaged their cavalry. Seeing this chaos unfold, Antipater abandoned the battlefield and fled to the city of Lamia. Leosthenes approached the city with his troops and set up a siege camp. From there, Leosthenes developed a three-tiered plan to induce Lamia's surrender. First, he took troops and marched on the city to challenge the opponents to a field battle. This failed, so Leosthenes moved on to phase 2, launching daily assaults on the city walls. However, the Lamian walls were solid and stable, and the Macedonians had an ample supply of projectiles to lob at the attackers, who were consistently repelled. This infuriated Leosthenes, who decided to use the classic strategy of cutting off all supplies into the city and ruthlessly starving the defenders to death. He also began to dig a deep trench and build a wall to completely seal off the Macedonians from the outside world. In response, Antipater decided to go for a desperate strategy. Using projectiles for cover, he took his troops outside and raided the Athenian siege camp before the trench could be completed. This attack was a success, and Leosthenes, who rushed to the aid of the soldiers during the melee, was hit in the head by a slingshot. He was rushed to his tent and died 3 days later. After this, the arrival of veterans from Macedon finally lifted the siege. The Greeks burned their camp and retreated. They then went on to fight another battle in Meletea. In this battle, the southern Hellenes were led by Antiphilos, an Athenian with 25,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. They faced down the Macedonian Diadochi Leonatos, who possessed 20,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry. A contingent of Thessalian cavalrymen, notorious for their equestrian skills and good breed of war horses, were there with Antiphilos, giving the southern Hellenes a slight advantage. After the battle lines had been drawn on both sides, Leonatos ordered his cavalry and phalanx to march forward. The Macedonian phalanx was highly successful against the Athenians due to the effectiveness of their infamous sarisse spears, but the Thessalians pushed the Macedonian cavalry away, forcing them to retreat up the hills and gain a positional advantage. This was to be Leonatos' end, for he was mortally wounded during the commotion and died. The Thessalians tried to reach them but could not. The next day, Antipater arrived with his own troops and sought to escape from the Greeks. He managed to unite the reinforcements and his own forces at the plain, and then gained the advantage of vantage points to gain control of the landscape and provide cover for all his troops, like Artemis and Apollo shooting at Niobe's children from the sky. He took his army and left, ending the battle. Despite setbacks on land, Athens had a massive fleet it could muster against the Macedonians, though it did have issues with a lack of enough personnel to man the entire fleet, and ended up only sending off half of it. The Macedonians had issues with numbers until Kletos the White, one of Alexander's generals, arrived with reinforcements, which shifted the balance of war at sea. Here our sources become jumbled. There is no detailed account of the Seaborne War, but we know of at least 2 battles. What we know is that Kletos achieved victory over the Greek rebels in the Battle of Echinades, and again in another battle on the Cyclades Islands. We know these Macedonian victories caused heavy losses to the Athenian allies, and ended the thalassocracy of Athens. In August 322 BCE, the Macedonians began their march into the rest of Greece to restore the order of things established by Alexander. Reinforcements came to enhance them, and thus, well-armed and well-supplied, they moved to the south for their vengeful strikes. Athens, Thessaly and the Aetolians rallied their troops and went forward to fight them in what has now become the Battle of Crannon. This is the last battle of the Greek revolt that we know of, and the one that genuinely sealed the fate of Hellas. Antipater's forces numbered 40,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 3,000 slingers and archers. The Allied forces included 25,000 infantry and 3,500 cavalry. However, the Thessalians were confident in their own horses, which were known for their strength, size, and endurance. Antiphilos, the general of the Athenians and the allies, put his cavalry on the right flank. Antipater put his own cavalry opposite them on his left flank. Antiphilos commenced the battle by sending the cavalry forward. The 2 mounted armies clashed, and after the conflict, the more robust and durable Thessalian cavalry managed to push off the Macedonians. The battle then continued with the infantry sections of the army. The Macedonians continued pressing and slowly pushed off the anti-Macedonian front onto higher ground on the battlefield. The anti-Macedonians managed to push off any further attacks, while the cavalry, seeing that they were now without infantry allies, decided to retreat. The battle continued until the Athenians surrendered. 500 Athenians and allies died, while only 130 Macedonians died. Menon of Pharsalos, the leader of the cavalry, decided that the war was lost, and thus decided to send emissaries for surrender. Antipater was not amused and refused to negotiate. Slowly, the Macedonians took Thessalian cities, and each city surrendered separately. Left without allies, Athens finally surrendered unconditionally. The punishment of the Athenians was great, as they had an oligarchy imposed upon them led by a man named Phocion. Athenian contingents were to leave the Cleruches, her settler colonies, as well as pay massive war reparations. In nearby Munichia, a Macedonian guard was to be established to keep controlling the Athenians, and anti-Macedonian rhetoricians were to be arrested. One of them, the famous Demosthenes, decided to commit suicide rather than be arrested by his enemies. From then on, the politics of Greek city-states would appear and disappear like shades of the dead in the Odyssey. Various Diadochi would make various declarations in places like Corinth linked to defending Hellenic freedom, or promise various factions freedom, control over city-states, or restoration of previous regimes. This is an important thing to consider contextually. It was an attempt to show the Greek city-states that they depended on whichever state of the Diadochi was promising them freedom. The revolt in southern Greece was over. Meanwhile, Cappadocia, which is recorded to have had various small-scale revolts, was subdued by Eumenes. However, the courtly scheming among the Diadochi would only continue. Factionalism slowly grew among the friends and generals of the late great Alexander, as Antigonos, Antipater and Cretopolis began to see Perdiccas as a man with too much power, which he was wielding for his own gain. In fact, after the death of Leonatos, he was to marry Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, instead. This was orchestrated by an old player in the court, Olympias, Alexander's mother. This was a major offense to Antipater, as his daughter had originally been Perdiccas' intended. With Cleopatra as Perdiccas' wife, any children Perdiccas had would be first in line for the throne, as Heracles and the now-born baby boy Alexander IV were half Persian, and xenophobia meant that they were disadvantaged in the line of succession. Cretopolis was ordered by Antipater to take care in an increasingly hostile case of saber-rattling between Antigonos and Perdiccas in Asia Minor. Perdiccas found Eumenes, Seleucus, Python and Antigones to be his allies, as they all had proximal satrapies under their command. Then, out of nowhere, a wild card appeared. Ptolemy had arrived in the rich and ancient powerhouse of Egypt, an important location with bountiful grain and a sophisticated state bureaucracy. The wily master of Egypt had likely been scheming for his own independence for a long while. To achieve the legitimacy to do so, he decided to do the unthinkable. Alexander's body was in Babylon until Perdiccas sent it forth to Macedon to be buried. Along the way, and we are unsure as to where this occurred, Ptolemy appeared like the chaos snake Apophis and stole the body. He took it to Egypt, where it remains to this day undiscovered. This was more an excuse for the background scheming, but it did cause the furious Perdiccas to declare war, and thus the First War of the Diadochi began. Antigonus, the governor of Phrygia, joined Antipater after receiving incriminating letters written by Perdiccas, which revealed that he was scheming to discard his wife Nicaea, who was Antipater's daughter, in order to marry Alexander's sister Cleopatra. Even before this, Antigonos had disliked Perdiccas, as did Ptolemy, due to frictions in personal and likely courtly relationships. This event spurred Antigonos to begin mustering his troops to cross into Asia and overthrow Perdiccas, thus commencing the war. On his end, Perdiccas was not without friends. Eumenes, who had received and subsequently tamed the restless province of Cappadocia, was allied with him, as were some other generals like Antigones, Python and Seleucus. Archidaeus, henceforth known as Philip III, was likely still in Babylon with his half-niece wife Eurydice. The tale of how the couple married is noteworthy in itself, and we discuss it here. Eurydice was the daughter of Alexander's half-sister by an Illyrian warrior princess, Kinane, and King Amyntas IV. Kinane had already begun marching on Babylon as soon as she heard of Philip's ascent, but Perdiccas, terrified that he would lose power should she arrive, as the fierce princess could assume an active political role in her capacity as queen, sent his brother Alcetus to confront her. Alcetus killed the fearless princess in the commotion, but his troops, disturbed at the death of a royal of Macedon, revolted against him and then brought Eurydice to be married. Kiane, Eurydice and other Argead princesses like Thessaloniki and Cleopatra were fearless and scheming in their own right, and had ancient Macedon society been less decidedly patriarchal, they might have achieved as much as Alexander himself. Perdiccas had two fronts to fight on, Egypt and Asia Minor. As Eumenes was in Cappadocia, it was far better for him to be dispatched to deal with Cretopolis and Antigonos. He himself assembled his generals and marched on from Babylon. Ptolemy was expecting this, and using his newfound resources in the bureaucracy of Egypt, began to fortify the borders of the Nile. Perdiccas marched through Syria, Palestine and the Sinai Peninsula south towards Egypt. In 321 BCE, he arrived near the city of Pelusium, on the easternmost riverbank of the Nile. Opposite him were the Ptolemaic troops under the command of the future founder of the dynasty, Ptolemy. Garrisons were staged across the river, prepared to meet the pretender emperor, while the major Ptolemaic force was mobile and ready to move at will to any part of the front. Perdiccas began to look for a good place to cross, but could find nothing as Ptolemy was following his every move from across the Nile. Perdiccas understood that if the rebels gained strongholds in their satrapies, things would escalate and the war would drag out indefinitely. Unable to afford this, he chose stealthiness and moved upriver under the cover of darkness to find a place to cross while evading Ptolemy's detection. All night, the army of Perdiccas marched until they reached a fort called Camel's Rampart, where a small garrison had been placed in accordance with Ptolemaic strategy. Before Selene, Khonshu and Al-Lat departed to greet the dawn deities Eos, Rakepri and Shahar, Perdiccas assembled his forces and attacked the fort. His Indian elephants were in front, while the silver shields were straight behind, ready to scale the walls with ladders. Meanwhile, Perdiccas himself was at the rear flank with his cavalry. It appeared like the perfect plan, combining the might of the elephants to pressure the defenders and use the silver shields to scale the walls. However, Ptolemy had managed to counter this and use his troops' speed and discipline to catch up with the enemy. Entering the fort, the governor of Egypt pushed the attackers back. Perdiccas, ever desperate, threw his elephants and silver shields against the Camel Rampart's walls. After multiple waves of assault upon the now fully garrisoned walls and high casualties on both sides, Perdiccas decided to retreat and find a hotspot further down south for his crossing. He eventually found the site of Memphis, where a small island lay between the two riverbanks, but the current and depth made the crossing incredibly challenging. Perdiccas put forth his elephants in a line next to the islet and used their massive size to lower the current, and in front of them placed the cavalry to pick up any stragglers in the current. His troops began to march to the island, and initially some of them succeeded. The problem was that the sinking sand of the river almost made the elephants and horses lose their footing, and thus they retreated back to the shore. A large contingent of the force was now stranded, and a desperate Perdiccas summoned them back through a much deeper Nile. While some survived, a lot of soldiers perished. Much like Caligula would centuries later, Perdiccas had fought a battle with water and lost. The campaign to recover the body of Alexander in Egypt and restore order to the Macedonian Empire was in complete chaos, and perhaps understandably, Perdiccas' soldiers were extremely angry. His chief allies, such as Antigonos, Python and Seleucus, were now convinced that Perdiccas was criminally incompetent. Seeing that the soldiers were angry and out for blood, these three decided to restore order the only way they knew how, entering Perdiccas' tent and killing him, unceremoniously ending the life of the regent of Babylon in the first year of the Wars of the Diadochi. Perdiccas was ultimately a competent but unfortunate man. He was indeed skilled in both court politics and in putting down rebellions, and proved as much during his prime when he fought alongside Alexander. But in the end, he could not face so many misfortunes in the cutthroat world of Hellenistic generalship. The three generals packed up and left Egypt, leaving Ptolemy to return to his newfound empire and eagerly begin mixing Egyptian and Greek customs for a new age. On the northern fronts, there was absolute chaos as well. Eumenes had lost control of the fleet, whose sailors saw Perdiccas as a weak and scheming king. They thus defected and moved to the European side of the Hellespont to help Antigonos, Antipater and Cretopolis. Alcetus, alongside other generals, was not willing to serve under Eumenes, and a certain Neoptolemus even mutinied. He fled from Eumenes after losing the short battle and marched to join Antipater. After receiving Neoptolemus, Antipater split his forces in two, himself going east and then south towards Egypt, while Cretopolis stayed in Anatolia to fight Eumenes. Eumenes had some local troops under the command of the Persian satrap Pharnabazos III, who amassed his cavalry and a certain Phoenix of Tenedos. He had approximately 20,000 troops, while Cretopolis and Neoptolemus also had around 20,000 troops to command. The combination of Persian troops was helpful for Eumenes, but he also knew that many of the Macedonian troops respected and feared Craterus, a notorious general and skilled tactician. Craterus was part of the infamous left flank of the Battle of Issos, and participated in campaigns with Alexander all over Asia and all the way to India, where he commanded the rear in the Battle of Hydaspes. His conduct in the Lamian War, while likely unknown in detail by the soldiers in the east, further provided his credentials. Eumenes knew that a fight between Macedonians would not be welcomed by his soldiers, and devised a plan worthy of Sisyphus. When the two armies met somewhere in Phrygia to fight the famous Battle of the Hellespont, Eumenes lied to his men. He told the troops that they would not be fighting Craterus but Neoptolemus, whom they already saw as a traitor. He then took the Thracians and Asians, who had no respect for Craterus, a man they knew little of, and positioned them all as cavalry on the left flank, facing Craterus's right flank. This was unusual, for this position was usually reserved for Macedonian nobles, who saw it as an honourable position. Eumenes' long centre line was composed of a small contingent of Macedonian phalangists as its core and local mercenaries surrounding them. Eumenes himself went on the right flank with the Cappadocians, who now respected him. On the other end of the field, Craterus placed himself alongside his companions on the right wing flank, with a large corps of Macedonian infantry at the centre. This centre was placed in pike formation, while Neoptolemus was on the left flank opposite Eumenes with cavalry. Craterus is said to have marched forth first from his flank, and at that moment Eumenes commenced his double flank assault. The Thracians sprung forth and clashed with Craterus, while Eumenes went forth to face Neoptolemus. The distance made sure that none of the Macedonians on Eumenes' side heard Craterus' voice. Craterus met his end that day, either falling from his horse and being trampled, or merely dying from the brutal cavalry combat. So ended the life of the great general, causing his cavalry flank to disband in chaos. On the other side of the battle, Eumenes and Neoptolemus' troops were engaged in mortal combat, and the two generals sought to fight each other. Eventually they saw each other and shot forth into the deep. In the ensuing battle, the older and more experienced Eumenes defeated and killed Neoptolemus, severing the generalship on both sides of the enemy army. Thus, Eumenes was triumphant once more. The Macedonian enemy troops joined him at first, after Eumenes offered them amnesty and a chance to join him, but soon after they changed their minds, fleeing towards Antipater. The troops in Egypt had sided with Ptolemy in the end, and the three generals were also in the country. Antipater initially hoped to get Ptolemy as regent, but the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty refused. The best way to solve this impasse, as well as acknowledge the power of Python, Seleucus and Antigones, was the Partition of Triparadeisos of 321 BC, when the generals met in the titular town of Triparadeisos in modern-day Lebanon. A key unresolved issue at this meeting was that Eumenes was not invited, but we will get to that later. In this conclave of generalissimos, the empire was redivided. Seleucus, who had managed to secure his position, began negotiations with Antipater. Against the protests of Eurydice, General Arrhidaeus was made co-regent alongside Python. Roxane's baby son, Alexander IV, was to move with his mother to Pella in Macedon. Seleucus became governor of Babylon, which would serve him well in future endeavours, and Antigones received Susa. Antigonus received multiple Anatolian satrapies, and other less seminal generals and local nobles received or maintained their satrapies. Antigonus, having received regions like Phrygia, was also entrusted with one more task, defeating the lone rebel Eumenes. To that end, he set forth from Triparadeisos and moved back north to the lands where Phrygians and Greeks mingled. As his enemies advanced on him, an increasingly isolated Eumenes was desperately seeking allies. Perdiccas' brother Alcetus was an obvious choice, despite their differences, so he went to Pisidia to discuss a potential partnership with him. Unfortunately, both wished to rule the army, and after much headbutting, Eumenes left with his troops, presumably after pillaging and stealing all food from Alcetus' camp. It was now a deadly game of cat and mouse in the depths of Anatolia, where the ghosts of Xenophon's 10,000 roamed in Hittite and Lydian ruins alongside the shade of Croesus. Antigonus continued to march, trying to hunt Eumenes down. In a mysterious place called Orkynia, Eumenes decided to make a final stand. However, the sly old fox Antigonos was not going to fight without some Odyssean tricks of his own. We know little about this specific battle, but Antigonos and Eumenes likely both employed typical formations of cavalry on their flanks and typical Macedonian phalanxes in their centres. Antigonos elongated his phalanxes by having them half in depth, causing the enemy forces of Eumenes to think that the Antigonid army had been empowered by an even more powerful barrage of reinforcements. As the armies prepared to fight, yet another misfortune struck Eumenes. Apollonides, his cavalry commander from the other flank, deserted and joined Antigonos. The Antigonids routed the Eumenidean force and caused mass catastrophe in the ensuing battle. Eumenes and his remnants escaped and went to the east, to the fortress of Nora. On the way, he was chased by the elder Antigonos, but Eumenes managed to avoid further battles, even going so far as sending a secret message to one of Antigonos' generals, Menander, to hide their baggage so Eumenes' own troops wouldn't get out of control and loot it. Eventually, Eumenes reached Nora and hid within its walls. Antigonos surrounded him and besieged the city, but there was still another remnant faction to deal with, that of Alcetus. Thus, he left a token force to continue the siege and went west to Pisidia to snuff out the flames of Perdican disorder. We know very little of the so-called Battle of Cretopolis, but there are some details we can go off to recreate a relatively consistent play-by-play. Alcetus, as well as his allies Attilos, Dokimos and Polymon, were amassing their forces to try and gain a foothold in Anatolia and had taken control of a pass near Cretopolis. Antigonos' forces consisted of 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry and 200 elephants, as opposed to Alcetus' forces, which numbered around 20,000. Diodorus mentions that Antigonos' army managed to march through most of Anatolia in 7 days, a feat of incredible endurance and discipline. Antigonos' troops, like an army of solid snakes and Sam fishers, arrived so quickly that the enemy was completely surprised. The trumpets of the elephant troops were the first thing that Alcetus' troops heard, and they realized that they were completely screwed. Antigonos seized some nearby hills and managed to gain the higher ground. Antigonos and Dokimos formed their phalanxes, but Alcetus, with the cavalry and the peltasts, summited the hills on the ridge and began to attack. Antigonus, however, was possessed of Heracles' strength while wrestling Kerberos, the Hound of Hades. He took 6,000 cavalry and then charged down the hill with incredible speed. The two cavalry forces crashed, and Alcetus was defeated. He ordered the cavalry to retreat, and moved back to the phalanx, sustaining heavy losses. The Antigonid forces began to descend on the remnants of the Perdican force, and the phalanx had no time to form up. Thus, they took their most desperate and difficult decision to surrender. Alcetus escaped with local Pisidians and fled to the city of Temessos. However, the local population wanted to hand him over to Antigonos, so Alcetus committed suicide. The Perdican upstarts were now completely defeated. While all this had been happening, Eumenes remained trapped in Nora, struggling to find a way out of the fight. Antigonus returned with the full might of his armies, but continued to have difficulties getting into the city. Inside, Eumenes had maintained a strict fitness regimen by making makeshift gyms for his soldiers. Thus, despite being outnumbered and trapped, morale among Eumenes' men was high. It took over a year of negotiations, but eventually some sort of deal was struck, and messengers were dispatched with details of peace deals for Eumenes. Antigonos was also not keen on killing Eumenes, thinking him a skilled general to have by his side. The messengers made their way to Macedonia, where Antipater had moved back to, alongside his son Cassander, his ally Polyperchon, and the family of Alexander, including his widow Roshanek and son Alexander IV. Barsani was likely at Pergamon at this time. The messengers reached Pella, but shocking news awaited them. Antipater had died at age 81 and chosen Polyperchon over his son Cassander for his successor as regent. Cassander was angry and demanded the position. Thus, the Second War of the Diadochi, with new alliances, was about to begin. The First War of the Diadochi was a titanic whirlwind, with one more partition, the deaths of major players, incredible betrayals, and absolutely chaotic geopolitics. This was only a taste of things to come. After Antipater's death, Eumenes was still stuck in Nora, due to being under siege by Antigonos. However, his fortunes did a turnabout when the ever-ambitious Antigonos decided to spare him due to his skills as a general, likely to get him as an ally, asking him to become the governor of Cappadocia and to become his right-hand man. Meanwhile, back in mainland Greece, trouble was brewing as both Cassander and Polyperchon were gathering allies to eliminate the other and secure their place as sole regent of the Macedonian Empire. Lines had begun to be drawn in the sand when Cassander, lacking allies in Pella, fled Macedon and arrived at the court of Antigonos, the nearest person who could be sympathetic to him. He also gauged Ptolemy's support via correspondence, and presumably after mastering the walk like an Egyptian dance, the new ruler of Egypt agreed to lend him aid. In the meantime, Roshanak and her son were sent to Pella, where they were entrusted to the care of Polyperchon and later Olympias. The spark that spread the fires of war was lit in 318 BCE, when the ruler of Hellespontine Phrygia, Arrhidaeus, found out that Antigonos was preparing for war and began to arm himself in retaliation. One city, Cyzicus, did not comply with Arrhidaeus' command, and the furious satrap invaded and laid siege to the city. Accusing Arrhidaeus of attacking an allied city, Antigonos marched forth to confront him with 20,000 infantry, causing Arrhidaeus to stop the siege and flee to a fortress in the city of Chios. Meanwhile, in Macedon, Polyperchon was debating the best way to gather external allies. To that end, he issued a decree to appeal to the democratic rights of Greek polis, reversing Antipater's politically restrictive policies to get the Greek city-states on his side. Polyperchon also extended an olive branch to Eumenes. Sending envoys to the general, he offered to make him king in Asia and give him access to the Kinder treasury and the silver shields who guarded it. From the lands of Cybele, Eumenes agreed to this most generous offer and abandoned Antigonos, defecting to Polyperchon's side. He also wrote to Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, to make her an ally of his, to which she agreed. The mother of the late great conqueror was presently taking care of her daughter-in-law Roshanak and her grandson Alexander IV, all of whom would prove to be valuable political chess pieces in the conflict to come. When Antigonos found out about Eumenes' treachery, he furiously sent an army into Cappadocia to intercept and capture him, but the turncoat eluded his soldiers. It is here that the war splits into two fronts: the Eumenes-Antigonos War in the lands of the east, and the Western Front in Greece. In the west, Polyperchon, who was claiming to be a defender of the freedom of the polis from Macedonian control, faced an unexpected nest of opposition. First, he went to Athens to seize the fortress of Munichia. He was thwarted in this by Cassander, who arrived with his navy. Polyperchon then moved to the south, to the Arcadian city of Megalopolis, which was an oligarchy dominated by a major political figure called Damis, who was said to have fought with Alexander. Damis rejected the rule of Polyperchon, likely due to the latter claiming to support democratic polis. Unable to tolerate this slight, Polyperchon organized his forces, which totaled 24,000 infantry, 65 elephants, and 1,000 cavalry. He also organized a siege in Athens to occur in the meantime, of which we sadly know very little. When Polyperchon's army arrived at Megalopolis, they immediately put the city under siege, using towers and sapper tunnels to destroy its defenses. The local citizens' militia, numbering around 15,000 and led by Damis, was able to hold the attacking army at bay for a time, but soon the besiegers broke through part of the wall. Polyperchon, captivated by the glee of impending victory, ordered his troops to enter the city. However, the local militia detected the broken parts of the wall and stood tall, sealing the breach with their spears. Eventually, the attackers were forced to retreat after sustaining heavy losses. The breaches were repaired, and trap spikes were set up outside the city. Polyperchon was furious, and the next day ordered the ancient world's mother of all bombs, the war elephant, to move forward and take the city. Damis led the elephant's advance all the way into the makeshift repairs of the walls, where the traps his militia had placed managed to wound and panic the giant pachyderms. Simultaneously, the militia showered the great beasts with arrow fire. Through these combined efforts, the elephant attack was neutered, with the panicked pachyderms stepping on attacking soldiers and causing chaos within Polyperchon's ranks. After failing yet again, Polyperchon, angry that he was being resisted, retreated from the city. The siege in Athens also failed, with Cassander winning the favour of the Athenians. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, 2 more battles took place in Byzantium. Here the Antigonid navy faced off against Cleitus the White, a general of Alexander who had sided with Polyperchon and been instructed to guard the Hellespont. In the first battle of the Hellespont, which likely happened at the same time or slightly after the siege of Megalopolis, Cleitus defeated the defender of Athens, Nicanor, a Macedonian garrison leader who was stationed on Cassander's behalf in Athens. However, Nicanor and Antigonos were soon invigorated with reinforcements from the Antigonid faction. They secretly sent peltasts and archers onto the shore and organized their infantry to work as an amphibious force. Launching a surprise attack at dawn, they defeated Cleitus on both land and sea. Cleitus tried to escape on a ship, but was captured and executed by Lysimachos' men. Back in the west, Polyperchon was now in trouble, as more and more Greek cities joined Cassander. Thus he fled northward, taking Roshenak and Alexander IV to Epirus. There, he and Olympias managed to gain military support from the Epirot king, who was from the same family as Olympias. Philip III, Alexander's brother and candidate for the throne, and Aedia Eurydice, daughter of Kinani, Alexander's half-Illyrian sister, who had sided with Cassander, took up residence in Pella. But soon the Epirot troops invaded Macedon and took the city. The power couple fled to Amphipolis, where they were besieged and captured. Our accounts claim that Olympias murdered her stepson, Philip Arrhidaeus, and gave Aedia Eurydice a choice: to commit suicide by either hanging herself or drinking poison. Defiant to the end, the Illyrian Macedonian noblewoman tended to her husband's corpse, as was the duty of wives at the time, and then hanged herself by his side. However, she chose to use her own belt, and not the noose provided by Olympias, choosing her own way into the House of Hades to meet her husband. Thus ended one faction of the House of Philip, leaving Alexander's children by Barsani and Roshenak to claim the throne of the world. The Hellenes were heading east once more, as Antigonos and his armies marched towards the rising sun in pursuit of a fleeing Eumenes, who was hoping to gain allies deeper in Asia. Eumenes reached Susa, and by the rivers of the Anahita, he tried to negotiate an alliance with some of the local satraps. Amongst the ones that joined him were Pukestus, who ran Persis in southern Iran, Eudamos, who had command of Indian garrisons, and the Silver Shield commanders, Antigones and Teutemos. However, Antigonos' forces were also swelling as he received some reinforcements from some of his allies. He continued to march through Persia, hoping that these additional troops would allow him to win against Eumenes. The 2 multi-ethnic armies met on opposite banks at the Daz River in Iran, which the Greeks called Coprates. As the enemies began their standoff, 6,000 of Antigonos' men began to advance upon the only bridge across the river. Eumenes managed to rout them, and then, after a brutal melee that saw over 2,000 of Antigonos' men killed, the 4,000 survivors were taken prisoner. Knowing that the river crossing was now impossible, Antigonos moved north to Paraitakene across the Zagros mountains in order to move around Eumenes. Eumenes wished to go west to areas where he could organize more effectively, but the eastern satraps feared that Antigonid raids in their lands would destabilize their power, so they compelled Eumenes to follow Antigonos and confront him directly at Paraitakene, where the battle took place. Antigonos' army consisted of 28,000 heavy infantry, 5,500 light infantry, 6,900 light cavalry, 3,700 heavy cavalry, and 65 war elephants. Eumenes' army consisted of 17,000 heavy infantry, 18,000 light infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 125 war elephants. Eumenes placed his left flank under Eudamos and put some of his cavalry there, protected by a lancer vanguard. The center was dominated by his heavy infantry. At the edge were the Silver Shields, their right flank bolstered by Eumenes himself at the head of his remaining cavalry. The elephants and the light infantry alternated in front of these flanks. Antigonos, meanwhile, placed his light cavalry on his left flank, under his lieutenant Python. At the right flank stood Antigonos, with his firstborn son and heir, a young Demetrius, commanding the elite Agama cavalry, or bodyguard unit. He also put most of the elephants in this right flank, and put the rest sparsely in the center and left. Antigonos began the battle by moving his right flank forward, with the left flank staying behind as instructed due to their more lightly armoured nature. The enemy's right flank was on high ground, but Python had to move forward because the ground where he was lower, and it was the only section of the army that could flank the enemy. Python used javelins and arrows to rain hell on the enemy elephants until Eumenes signalled for his light cavalry to emerge and attack them. The Eumenid cavalry fought their way to Python's forces and managed to rout them off the battlefield. Following this, a contingent of elephants followed them and trapped them in the foothills. Meanwhile, the army's centres marched and crashed into each other, and a battle worthy of that of Heracles and the Nemean lion ensued. The enemies pushed against each other, but the Eumenid force had an advantage: the experienced silver shields. These elderly warriors had experienced combat under both Philip and Alexander the Great, and despite being in their 60s, they fought expertly and broke their opposing phalanx. The Antigonid infantry was in disarray. However, Antigonos was not one to give up easily and pushed his own flank forward. With overwhelming force, he managed to crush the enemy flank. Antigonos had won his section of the theatre of the contest, but Eumenes had won the battle as a whole, having lost only 540 infantry, a handful of cavalry, and 900 wounded, to Antigonos' 3,700 infantry, 54 cavalry, and 4,000 wounded. Knowing his army's morale was low, Antigonos waited until nightfall and then left the field. Eumenes was gleeful and retreated to his winter quarters, expecting no further battles. Time would prove him wrong. Antigonos retreated back into Media, while Eumenes moved to winter in Gabiene. While in Media, Antigonos conspired to catch the old fox Eumenes by surprise, so he took part of his army and marched through the cold Persian winter of 316 BCE, trekking through the harsh terrain and Angramanus's blizzard storms. Somehow this plan was discovered by Eumenes, who scrambled his troops and organized them for a fight. To intimidate Antigonos, he put small contingents on the various hills and then lit campfires to give the impression that their forces were massive in size. Antigonos held back from the attack, waiting for the rest of his army to make the trek and join him. The two armies met in the fields of Gabiene. Antigonos' army consisted of 22,000 heavy infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 65 elephants. Eumenes' army consisted of 36,700 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 114 elephants. The plains of Gabiene were wide and open, providing ample opportunity for formation combat. Antigonos put Python with the cavalry on the left flank, while he and Demetrius took up the right flank at the command of their most elite troops. The centre included the cavalry, with the elephants in front as a vanguard. Eumenes put himself at the left flank of his own formation, leading the cavalry, placing the silver shields next to him, and placing the rest of the infantry across the rest of the line, with the elephants similarly spread out as a vanguard. The right flank included light cavalry and some backup elephants. Eumenes began by commanding the elephants in the left and centre to begin marching. He then took his own troops on the left flank and pushed forward behind them. The Persian deities which roamed these lands must have laughed at the man's hubris, as the elephants caused mass sand clouds to emerge behind them, blinding the advancing cavalry. Antigonos instantly pounced at the opportunity. Using the cover of the sands, he sent part of his light cavalry to go across the lines. He made it to the baggage of the Eumenid troops and seized it. Eumenes struck into Antigonos' lines, but the charge failed. Bukestas, who was with Eumenes in the cavalry charge, felt that all was lost and retreated with his forces, while Eumenes was left to hold the line. The silver shields could not have appeared at a more desperate moment, as they marched behind the elephants and pummeled Antigonos' infantry, crushing through part of the formation. The chaos led to a stalemate, as both sides moved back to their camps. As night fell, Eumenes hoped to rally the disgruntled troops to fight the next day, but news of the heist of the baggage train reached camp, and this led to anger amongst the troops. It was at this point that the Silver Shields, who found Eumenes' origins in southern Greece and not in Macedonia to be a point of distrust, staged a revolt. The Silver Shields were always on the march, so the baggage train included their families and everything they held as their own property. Thus they felt betrayed by Eumenes and disillusioned with his skills as a general. They captured the old warrior and brought him before Antigonus. Despite being delivered to his enemy on a silver platter, or shield in this case, Antigonus was hesitant to execute Eumenes, still having respect for the man. However, after much deliberation and self-reflection, he ultimately ordered that the old Diadochos be put to the sword. Thus, Eumenes of Cardia died on that day, ending the war in the east. Eudamos and Antigones were also executed, and the silver shields, proven to be untrustworthy after killing their commander, were sent to Arachosia to fight until they all perished. In the west, after a long struggle, Cassander gained the upper hand. Given that Polyperchon was conducting his war poorly, and had lost both in Byzantium and Megalopolis, more and more Polis began to join Cassander's side. Athens was firmly with Cassander, as were multiple other states. Thus he marched on to Pella and managed to conquer the city. Polyperchon managed to flee Macedonia and moved to the Peloponnese, where some remnant Polis like Corinth were still in favour of him. He was reduced to a minor player, though one that was still active in the shifting Hellenistic alliances of the day. Olympias, however, was found and captured in Pydna, alongside Roshanak, Alexander IV, Cassander's brother, and some other captives. Cassander decided to kill the mother of the late great conqueror, but the troops who loved Alexander refused to do the deed. Instead, her demise was left to the families of the people she had schemed against and murdered, who are said to have stoned her to death, with Cassander leaving her unburied. He took Roshanak and Alexander as prisoners to stay in Pella. The end of the Second War of the Diadochi in 316 BCE dramatically shifted Hellenistic geopolitics. After its conclusion, Cassander was the master of Greece, bordering Lysimachos' Thracian territories. Meanwhile, a vast territory, including Egypt, Cyrene, Syria, Libya, Cyprus, and other islands, was under Ptolemy. Antigonos now ruled all of Persia and Asia Minor, and was the undisputed top Kerberos in Asia. This stoked fear in the hearts of the other Diadochi, and the next year, the Third War of the Diadochi began. Ptolemy mustered the endless wealth of Egypt, while Lysimachos raised his Thracian forces to strike forth, and Cassander rallied the Greek Polis. In response, Antigonus assembled his troops. The Third War of the Diadochi began because of the competing political agendas of the surviving successors. Ptolemy's goal in the war was to maintain his independence in Egypt, a realistic ambition due to Egypt's well-defined eastern borders and strong bureaucratic state and identity. Antigonus, on the other hand, wanted to assume control of all the Diadochi territories, keeping Alexander's empire united, with himself at the helm. His own ambitions seem evident at this point, for he executed Python in 314 BCE when he assumed he was becoming too powerful, and annexed his satrapy of Media to his own empire. It is apparent that Antigonus had some plans for unifying the empire under his rule, as opposed to Ptolemy's own plans for keeping his own fiefdom. Thus, Antigonus and Ptolemy were almost destined to become enemies. Cassander, meanwhile, had decided to marry Alexander's sister, Thessalonike, shortly after his murder of Alexander's mother, Olympias. Through his political marriage, Cassander aimed to become Alexander in place of Alexander. Lysimachos' interests were similar to Ptolemy's, in that he wanted to ensure the independence of his territories, which bordered Antigonos. Seleucus' motives are less clear, likely jumping into the simmering pot of internecine conflict in order to regain his power and influence. Thus, when Seleucus arrived in Egypt and talked to Ptolemy, the two corresponded with the other two Diadochi in their camp, then sent an ultimatum to Antigonus, demanding that he redistribute the wealth of the empire in Babylon's treasuries and disband his army. These demands, if fulfilled, would essentially result in a new partition of Alexander's empire. Lysimachos demanded Hellespontine Phrygia, Cassander wished for Cappadocia and Lycia, Seleucus ordered the return of Babylon, and Ptolemy asked for Syria. The Diadochi made these demands on the basis that they had been allies against Eumenes and thus deserved a fairer deal. Naturally, the old general refused, declaring war through messengers, and the war began in 315 BCE. While it was Antigonus' enemies who took the political initiative, it was Antigonus who made the first strike of the war by attacking the Near Eastern provinces under Ptolemy's control. This flew in violation of the Triparadeisos agreement, which was important for launching any assaults into Asia Minor or Persia. Thus, the Third War began just like the previous ones, with court intrigue across the continents. Antigonus besieged Tyre like Alexander once did, but Ptolemy's navy kept sending aid to the city. As Egypt and Greece's endless navies commanded the seas, Antigonus summoned all the viceroys of Phoenicia and Syria, commanding them to establish 3 shipyards in Byblos, Sidon and Tripoli to build him a navy of his own to match. He also sent envoys to the island of Cyprus and managed to gain most of its city kingdoms to his side. However, the island must have been politically divided, as Seleucus, now admiral for Ptolemy, sailed past him and used Cyprus as a springboard to raid the southern coast of Antigonus's territories in Asia Minor. Moreover, Ptolemy, Cassander and Lysimachus sponsored a revolt against Antigonus led by Asander, Antigonus's subordinate who commanded Ionia and parts of Asia Minor. To cover this new front, Antigonus chose to send his nephew, ironically named Ptolemy, to deal with Asander. Antigonus also issued promises of freedom to the Greek polis in an attempt to turn them against his opponents. Not to be outdone, Ptolemy also announced a guarantee to the Greek city-states in order to counter Antigonus. Unable to take Tyre without sufficient naval support, Antigonus diverted his campaign to take Gaza and the Levant from Ptolemy before returning to Tyre for a second go at the city. Eventually, Tyre fell to Antigonus. Unfortunately, historical records are scant when it comes to explaining how. After his conquest of Tyre, Antigonus's victories began to compound when the Antigonid Ptolemy sent news of major victories in Asia Minor, which forced Asander to turtle up in his satrapy of Caria. Cassander was having a hard time and wanted to negotiate, as the Freedom Declaration spurred the Peloponnese into revolt alongside Polyperchon. Ptolemy was not standing idly by and sent further naval support. Still, the industrious Phoenicians had built a large armada already, and soon Antigonus's ships had achieved naval supremacy in the Aegean under the navarch Dioscurides. The one-eyed Titan decided to finish his affairs on the northern front, and with his horizon-spanning armies, marched through the Taurus Mountains to Asia Minor and then to Europe, where Lysimachus awaited him. Left to defend the new territories in the Levant was a young man named Demetrius, son of Antigonus and Stratonike. By his side were Python of Agenor and Nearchos, the admiral of Alexander. This was help he would certainly need, as in the southern deserts of the Sinai, Ptolemy and Seleucus were increasingly militant, hoping to break through the sands and burn the enemy. Demetrius positioned himself in Coele-Syria, awaiting an attack from the southern front. Still, Ptolemy took him by surprise when he took some of his ships, broke through the eastern Mediterranean, and then raided the southern front of Asia Minor with his troops. The young Prince of Asia was flabbergasted and turned his troops north to face the Hellenic pharaoh, but Ptolemy returned to the Nile before he could be confronted. There, he and Seleucus discussed their next steps, with the latter convincing the former to use Demetrius's absence in Cilicia to reconquer Coele-Syria. To that end, Ptolemy gathered his Egyptian and Macedonian troops and marched into the Sinai Peninsula towards Gaza. Demetrius was advised against fighting the two generals due to their skills in the art of war, but he was determined to protect his father's newfound provinces. Thus he marched through Syria and Judea to meet them in Gaza. The battle took place in a field between the Besor River and Gaza proper. Ptolemy and Seleucus commanded a sizable force, comprised of 18,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. On the other side of the field, Demetrius had 12,500 infantry, 4,400 cavalry, and 43 war elephants. The order of battle was as follows. The Antigonid left had 3,000 cavalry on its left flank, commanded by Demetrius and his advisors. 800 elite Macedonians and 100 elite light Tarentines, known for their javelins, supplemented the left flanks as well. In front of them stood 30 behemoth Indian elephants, with 1,500 light infantry wielding bows in between them. An 11,000-strong phalanx, comprised of 2,000 Macedonians and 9,000 mercenaries, appeared in the center block. The rest of the elephants, 13 in total, were in the front. The remaining 1,500 cavalry were on the right flank. Ptolemy and Seleucus had initial plans also to put their strong cavalry on their left flank, but they saw the enemy deployments and reversed course, placing 3,000 cavalry on their right flank. Ptolemy prepared for the brunt of the elephant charge by placing his engineers in front, who layered the field with metal spikes. Next to the spikes were javelin throwers. The center was filled with 18,000 infantrymen. The rest of the cavalry was placed on the left flank, numbering about 1,000 people. The battle began with Demetrius dashing forward at the head of his cavalry in a lightning bolt charge. Seleucus and Ptolemy met the charge head-on with their own mounted units, but in the ensuing clash, their cavalry was beaten back. However, Demetrius's charge had left his right wing wide open, allowing Seleucus and Ptolemy to maneuver the right flank of their elites around the inexperienced Demetrius. The spears clashed for a long while, with many noble and heroic men falling, but the melee ultimately ended inconclusively. Demetrius decided to order his elephants to charge and destroy the enemy. The Titans of antiquity marched forward, but their forward momentum was halted by the opponent's light cavalry, who rained endless javelins and arrows on the elephants. Trying to weather this storm, the elephant handlers fought through this hail of flak, but found themselves against the metal spikes. In a tragic end, the elephants were almost all killed or captured, and their handlers were all killed off. When the Antigonid army saw this carnage, morale plummeted and a rout ensued, with many fleeing back towards Gaza. Demetrius shouted and raged in an attempt to rally the army, but it was not meant to be. Thus he ordered a retreat, but his infantry was in chaos, making an orderly withdrawal impossible. Thus, Ptolemy and Seleucus surrounded the manic remnants of Demetrius's army and trapped them, capturing over 8,000 of them and killing the rest. Demetrius had lost his honor, but escaped the field with his life, managing to return to Phoenicia. Although Demetrius had been humiliated, Antigonus was achieving victories in his theatre. He had defeated Asander and sent his nephews to fight Cassander in Greece. Moreover, despite his humiliation, Demetrius did manage to win a significant victory in Myus in 312 BCE against an advancing general of Ptolemy called Chiles. Antigonus returned to Coele Syria with 80,000 men, and quickly took back the Phoenician coasts. Meanwhile, Ptolemy had given Seleucus 200 cavalry and 800 infantry and allowed him to move forth to recapture Babylon, the city he had been exiled from. Ptolemy himself marched back into Egypt in retreat. Meanwhile, while campaigning in Edom, Antigonus found out about another actor in the region, the wealthy Arabian kingdom of the Nabateans. The Nabateans controlled spices and the frankincense trade by taxing caravans passing through them to the port of Gaza, so Antigonus wished to secure control over them. This was the beginning of 3 Antigonid-Nabatean confrontations, all of which ended up being comically tragic failures for Antigonus and Demetrius. During the first confrontation, Antigonus sent one of his commanders, Athenaeus, to raid the region of the Nabateans and capture the animals there. According to Diodorus Sikellos, the Antigonid officer took 600 cavalry and 4,000 men. Together they marched through the region of Judea towards the settlement of Petra. The city's famed carved architecture was likely not commissioned at the time, but it appears that the Nabateans had already settled in the region and built some sort of trade hub there. The march took 3 days, but eventually the Antigonid force found the city to be devoid of male defenders due to a trade excursion. Thus they marched in and pillaged Petra, taking the women and children as slaves, as well as tons of silver and the Nabatean prized goods, which were frankincense and myrrh. The day after, they marched back along the same route as before, and managed to move a considerable distance by nightfall. However, the Nabatean civilians were not going to let them rest. A few of the prisoners escaped and tried to find a way back to Petra. However, they found something even more practical: a force of 8,000 Nabatean cavalry on camels, an animal superior to the horse in desert terrain. This force had been summoned by some nomads who had seen the Antigonid force leave the region with the enslaved citizens and were looking to intercept them. The prisoners provided them with the location of the Antigonid camp, and on they marched towards the raider Hellenes. Armed with their javelins, they arrived while the Antigonids were asleep and proceeded to massacre the entire contingent, including Athenaeus. Only 50 men from the cavalry survived, who fled in fear and spread the news of their destruction, while the civilians happily returned home to their families. The Nabateans sent a furious letter to Antigonus, clarifying that they acted in self-defense. Antigonus agreed with them and laid the blame on Athenaeus, trying to avoid the blame for acting like a common bandit. However, he was determined to try his luck out once more. For his second attempt, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius, alongside a far stronger force of 4,000 infantry and 4,000 horse cavalry. Their goals were to try and raid the Nabateans and gain part of their wealth, and also to try to vassalize the strategic region. Demetrius marched to the region, but the Nabateans had prepared, fearing the one-eyed general was deceiving them. Their lookouts discovered the marching army as they were entering the region, and signaled the main force to prepare itself. During the 3 days the Hellenes took to reach Petra, the Nabateans armed themselves, removed their civilians, and put their precious goods in a well-fortified mountain near Petra. Upon arriving at his destination, the young general saw the army waiting for him. The flocks of the Nabateans had already been dispersed into the desert, while a contingent was guarding the single entrance in the mountain towards the fortress. Thus, Demetrius sent his troops to assault the hill. The battle took all day and resulted in a stalemate, though we know little else about it. Thus, the next day, Demetrius prepared once more for an attack. However, the Nabateans saw him trying to reach the hill, and one of them yelled at him about the futility of his efforts. "King Demetrius, with what desire or under what compulsion do you war against us who live in the desert, and in a land that has neither water nor grain nor wine, nor any other thing whatever of those that pertain to the necessities of life among you? For we, since we are in no way willing to be slaves, have all taken refuge in a land that lacks all the things that are valued among other peoples, and have chosen to live a life in the desert, and one altogether like that of wild beasts, harming you not at all. We therefore beg both you and your father to do us no injury, but, after receiving gifts from us, to withdraw your army, and henceforth regard the Nabateans as your friends. For neither can you, if you wish, remain here many days, since you lack water and all the other necessary supplies, nor can you force us to live a different life. But you will have a few captives, disheartened slaves who would not consent to live among strange ways." This, according to Diadoros, is what caused Demetrius to withdraw and seek negotiations. The Nabateans negotiated an exchange, in which some of their wealth would be given as tribute, as well as some of the elderly as hostages. Demetrius agreed to these demands, and then withdrew back from whence he came. However, this was not the end of his presence in Arabia. Demetrius set up camp by the Dead Sea. Notorious for being so salty, it almost allows one to float on the surface of the lake. There he took some anthropological notes on the bitumen industry of the local Nabateans, something that is described in detail by Diadoros. He also sent reports to his father on both the industry and how it would be profitable, and on his deal with the Nabateans. Antigonus, who still wished to subdue the region, criticized his son for this deal, saying that he had emboldened the locals by allowing them to go unpunished for their supposed insolence. Thus, Demetrius sent the commander and historian Hieronymus, who served as a source for Diadoros, to try and raid the bitumen outposts of the Nabateans. We know little of what transpired, but according to Diadoros, the Nabateans organized themselves in amphibious guerrilla formations. They took rafts, and a contingent of 6,000 men sailed towards the expeditionary force in the Dead Sea, and, using arrows, killed almost the entire enemy force. This was the final confrontation. Antigonus by now had to worry about the upper satrapies and the Seleucid threat, so he decided to withdraw from the region. While they gained some valuable resources, they were ultimately forced to leave the stubbornly defiant Nabateans alone. Antigonus would have attacked the Nabateans further, but found himself having to relocate his military resources, for the conflict with his Diadochi rivals was soon to become a three-front war, as Seleucus advanced upon Babylon. Seleucus and his 1,000 troops were marching east through Syria when they were joined by 1,000 more soldiers from Carrhae, the city of astrologers. He arrived in Babylon in May to find the city gates open to him, likely due to the good relations he had cultivated with the city's elites. The general must have been gleeful at this reception, but his mood soured when he turned to the citadel and saw that Antigonid loyalists were barricaded inside. Thus, he and his troops blocked the citadel and initiated a siege. Seleucus cut off water in the city and then constructed a dam on the Euphrates River, which ran through the citadel. The Antigonid loyalists continued to resist, and thus Seleucus ordered the dam destroyed. a massive tidal wave crashed into the walls, smashing them apart. The citizens of Babylon must have been shocked at the titanic move, and after some small pockets of resistance were snuffed out, the Antigonids surrendered. Seleucus was finally ruler of Babylon, and by extension, the heart of the Persian Empire. Knowing things were about to get tough in the east, Antigonus began negotiations with Cassander and Lysimachus. At the same time, his satraps, Nicanor of Media and Euagoras of Aria, mustered 17,000 troops and moved to meet him. Flush from his victory in Babylon, Seleucus mustered 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. They moved into the marshes of the Tigris to intercept these two satraps before they could link up with Antigonus. When Nicanor and Euagoras arrived on the banks of the Tigris, they were unaware that Seleucus was still around. He thus ordered his men to camp for the night. Seleucus waited until nightfall, then pounced like a tiger upon Nicanor's poorly guarded stockade, engaging in a mass slaughter. Euagoras was killed in the commotion, causing the Persians under his command to change allegiances. Nicanor fled with a few remaining allies, leaving Seleucus to take over Media and Elam. While the havoc in the Orient was occurring, Antigonus was busy with negotiations. Ptolemy was brought into the discussions with the other Diadochi, resulting in the conclusion of a treaty known as the Peace of the Dynasts. Per its terms, Cassander received Macedon and Thessaly, and was permitted to put garrisons in Greek cities, which were now seen as independent by all kings. Lysimachus continued to own Thrace, while Ptolemy consolidated control over Cyprus and Egypt. Antigonus was left with the rest, but his core of control was centered around Phoenicia, Asia Minor, and Syria. It was also agreed that Alexander IV, son of Roshanak and Alexander III, would take over once he came of age. However, seeing the son of the great conqueror as a threat to his rule, Cassander decided to act, ordering him discreetly slain and his body hidden. Thus passed the son of Alexander, grandson of Philip, and the last king of the Argead dynasty which had ruled Macedonia for centuries. Roshanak perished as well in a foreign land. This tragic and unceremonious end is a testament to the brutality of Hellenistic politics. Cassander did not announce the deaths of Roshanak and Alexander IV publicly, fearing retribution, and thus continued to claim to rule as regent on behalf of Alexander's bloodline, rather than as a usurper king who had snuffed it out. One man was excluded from the Peace of the Dynasts, Seleucus, who now had taken the title Nicator, or the Victorious. He had now taken Aria and Persia, with only really Sogdiana and Bactria being free of his control. The Third War of the Diadochi was finally over, but the balance of power between the former generals of Alexander remained incredibly tense. Antigonus was determined to conquer the east once more, while Seleucus was spreading rumors that Alexander had appeared to him in a dream and had proclaimed him to be king. The sabers were rattled, and Antigonus began preparations to retake Babylon. War was coming once more, and the ancient fertile crescent would be its battleground. Before we get into the meat of the Babylonian War, we must first disclose that the available primary sources on this conflict are scarce, as the eastern parts of the Hellenistic world suffer from a general lack of detailed sources. As such, we will be constructing as coherent a narrative as we can with what we have. Ironically, for such a poorly attested conflict, the Babylonian War was extremely important. Without it, the Seleucid Empire would not exist, and the Antigonids would have been a far more powerful dynasty with a far wider reach. The war's background essentially stems from the failure to include Seleucus in the negotiations that led to the Peace of the Dynasts. The ever-ambitious Antigonus was bound to want to reconquer the East, while Seleucus was already spreading propaganda that he was visited in a dream by Alexander himself to gain his blessing and become king. Much like Alexander before him, Seleucus put a heavy emphasis on cultivating good relations with native rulers in the East, establishing strong friendships with powerful local dignitaries in Babylon while he was satrap, and even showering lavish charity upon the commoners of that city. Moreover, he was also one of Alexander's generals to actually maintain his Susa marriage with his Sogdian wife Apama. To increase connections with Persian nobles, the couple even claimed that Apama was the daughter of the erstwhile Persian King of Kings Darius III. All of these efforts to build a powerful alliance network and legitimize themselves as the rightful rulers of Asia suggest that the Seleucids were preparing to enact a very strong political agenda. Incidentally, the policies enacted by Seleucus were inherited by his successors, and the Seleucid legacy of cooperation and syncretization with the non-Greek elites in their territories explains why their empire managed a relatively long, multi-century lifespan. Wary of Seleucus' growing power in Babylon, Antigonus sent Demetrius to the city to sort out the situation. Demetrius marched on Babylon in command of 19,000 troops, of which 15,000 were infantry and 4,000 were cavalry. Meanwhile, Seleucus had begun his campaigns to subdue the eastern satrapies of the now defunct Achaemenid Empire, a campaign of which we know very little. The aim of these campaigns was not just to conquer through force, but also cultivate relations with friendly satraps. In essence, Seleucus was expanding his power base through both carrot and stick tactics, taking territories that had only been loosely controlled by the former Achaemenid Empire and consolidating them under his rule. This was happening while the Peace of the Dynasts was being negotiated. Negotiations that Seleucus may have been left out of due to envy and fear among his Diadochi peers that he was becoming too powerful. While Seleucus was absent from Babylon while Demetrius' army marched upon it, he had left a trusted commander, Patroclus, in command of the defense of the city. Patroclus' garrison likely numbered a few thousand men, though our sources do not clarify the exact manpower he had at his disposal. As Demetrius' armies marched into the satrapy of Babylon and drew closer to the city itself, Patroclus resorted to two strategies. One was guerrilla warfare, in which his men struck out from various hidden positions, attacking the army as they marched to Babylon proper. The other was similar to Seleucus' siege of Babylon, with Patroclus ordering the flooding of the irrigation canals of the region to delay Demetrius' advance. Ultimately, these measures only slowed Demetrius down, and eventually the invading army managed to reach the city of the Gate of the Gods. Ahead of Demetrius' arrival, Patroclus had ordered the city's civilian population to flee and restricted his defense to the city's defensible citadel. Demetrius entered the city without any resistance and then organized his troops to besiege the city. The length of the siege is unknown, but we do know that Demetrius broke through and plundered one of the city's citadels. Nevertheless, the defenders persisted. After concluding the Peace of the Dynasts, Antigonus called on Demetrius to return to the west. Demetrius did as bid, leaving his second-in-command Archelaus with 6,000 troops to continue the siege. However, news from Persia brought hope to the defenders. Seleucus had solidified control over parts of Persia, with many local satraps now backing him. Thus, he stormed back west to his beloved capital. Entering the satrapy with many troops, Seleucus pushed Archelaus out of the city. After a campaign of reconquest, he managed to convince the enemy troops to defect to his side, forcing Archelaus to escape back to Syria. We know little of what happened during the escape. What we do know is that after hearing the reports from Demetrius and Archelaus, Antigonus decided to sort the matter out personally. Seleucus was becoming too entrenched and powerful, and thus he had to be stamped out before he solidified control over Persia and Babylon's endless wealth. Thus, like Alexander's patron god Dionysus, Antigonus resolved to journey east and bring the upstart Seleucus to heel. To ensure his success in the eastern campaign to come, Antigonus invested heavily in personnel, amassing up to 75,000 troops. He likely began his march in late 310 BCE and moved through the Near East into modern-day Iraq. Seleucus must have been aware of the coming onslaught, but decided to remain in Babylon. On the 19th of January 309 BCE, Antigonus appeared on the outskirts of the city. This time around, the defenders of the city did not hold themselves up in the citadel, but garrisoned the entirety of the city, leaving no part of it for the invaders to occupy. Seleucus himself had taken up a position in a command center in the citadel, where he could survey the entire city. The siege began, and after an initial struggle, the Antigonid forces were able to break through the defenses and enter the city, whereupon Antigonos allegedly pillaged its sacred temples. However, this may be an anachronism written by later authors seeking to character assassinate him. Slowly, the overwhelming numbers of Antigonids fought their way through the streets, pushing the Seleucids back into the citadel. Here our record becomes very patchy. We know that Antigonos tried to take the citadel multiple times, but ultimately failed in each attempt. Eventually he decided to retreat from the city, but continued to roam the countryside. Knowing that the threat was too big, Seleucus chose to abandon Babylon in an organized and tactical retreat. This was so that they could regroup and change tactics if needed. Antigonos seized upon this opportunity, and after a long and Pyrrhic struggle, which had seen his army sustain heavy losses, he seized control of all of Babylon, declaring himself master of the city. Subsequently, his subordinate Archelaus was installed as a satrap of Babylon in order to bring control to the unruly region. As records mention that there was much misery during this period, we can assume that Archelaus was not kind to the conquered natives, exploiting them heavily for plunder. At some point before March 2nd, the retreating Seleucid army reached the nearby city of Kuta. Antigonos pursued them and besieged the city, causing the Seleucids to abandon Kuta and continue their retreat, pushing his mortal enemy further and further into the depths of Inner Asia. Antigonos seemed poised to solidify control over the heart of Mesopotamian knowledge and civilization. However, Seleucus soon reorganized his forces and began a campaign of guerrilla warfare against the Antigonid invaders. These asymmetrical attacks are not recorded, but they must have caused mass chaos among the enemy. An enraged Antigonos, possibly thinking the locals were on Seleucus' side, or that the Seleucids were getting supplies from the natives in the region, resorted to the most ancient and brutal of counterinsurgency tactics, terror. He proceeded to burn the countryside and cause mass destruction, which likely only emboldened locals against him. However, Antigonos' burning of the land ultimately forced Seleucus to come out of hiding and fight a conventional battle once more. Antigonos still had a numerical advantage, but Seleucus was determined not to go down without a fight. The two titans were now set to clash with one another in a classic Hellenistic field battle. Though in the end, it was cunning and treachery that would decide the war. The two armies ended up facing each other on August 10th, 309 BCE, or in the Babylonian calendars, the 25th of the month Abu. This battle survives in the historical record only through a short account by the 2nd century Greek historian Polyaenus. Nevertheless, it was possibly the most important battle of the Babylonian War. We don't know where the battle took place, but it likely occurred somewhere near Babylon. Moreover, the sizes of the Antigonid and Seleucid armies are unclear, but we can surmise that both had around the same number of troops that they had during the Third Siege of Babylon, with Antigonos leaving some in Babylon to make sure the city was under his control. The armies probably faced each other in similar Hellenistic formations and fought to a standstill. The battle lasted the whole day, but the turning point actually occurred when night fell, and the soldiers returned to their camps to rest. Antigonos ordered his men to disarm, dine, and then retire for the evening. Seleucus, in contrast, ordered his men to rest in full armor and battle formation. Then, before dawn, he ordered his men to take formation and march. As the dawn started to give way to sunrise, Seleucus' troops pounced and attacked the unprepared Antigonid encampment, whose soldiers had yet to arm and armor themselves. The ensuing massacre was likely massive. Despite scrambling to take up arms, the Seleucids were strong and fast. As a result, the battle ended in complete defeat and heavy casualties for Antigonos, though we have no clue about the number of dead on either side. This was most likely the last battle of the war. After this disaster, Antigonos was forced to withdraw his remaining troops from Babylonia and return to Syria. Seleucus was triumphant and returned to Babylon, reclaiming the city. On the heels of his military triumph and the reconquest of his capital city, Seleucus was finally able to establish his kingdom, with Babylon as the first of its many capitals. While not one of the main players in the initial stages of the war, Seleucus had succeeded in establishing his own empire and dynasty, the Seleucids. he was now free to turn to the Orient and conquer the remaining satrapies up to Bactria. Surviving ancient sources are patchy on what happened in the aftermath of the Babylonian War. For example, we do not know if a treaty was signed between Seleucus and Antigonos, or what its terms were if one was signed. However, it can be surmised that both belligerents now had other priorities that prevented them from reigniting their conflict against one another. For Antigonos, other issues were brewing in the Occident. From his power center amongst the sands of Egypt, Ptolemy was ensuring his naval dominance would not be questioned by the Antigonid navies again. The Hellenistic pharaoh moved to solidify control of Cyprus, whose city kingdoms had different sympathies and alliances, a pattern as old as the Ionian Revolt. Some of the pro-Ptolemy kings, like Nicocreon of Salamis in modern-day Famagusta, welcomed him. Others, like the king of Marion in the modern-day Acamas forests, supported Antigonos. Ptolemy razed Marion to the ground and abolished the city kingdoms of Cyprus, installing his local commander Nicocreon as the general in charge of the island. Ptolemy then moved on from Cyprus to the Cyclades, where he guaranteed the freedom of the city-states on those islands, before re-establishing the Nesiotic League, a confederacy of island polis now loyal to him. Ptolemy then landed in Corinth and declared the autonomy of the cities in the region. This presented a threat to Cassander, for Corinth's cities were his tributary vassals. Tensions between Cassander and Ptolemy soon began to rise in temperature. However, when both heard of Antigonos' failures in the Orient, they decided to sue for peace. Ptolemy retired to Egypt, where he negotiated an alliance with Cassander and Lysimachos against Antigonos. It is here that two major tragedies occur in Alexander the Great's extended family. One was his younger sister Cleopatra, who had spent a decade under house arrest by Antigonos in Sardis in Lydia. She was there because if she was to find a husband after Antipater, said husband could lay claim to the throne of the empire. Cleopatra knew Ptolemy, for they had grown up together in Pella, and thus she tried to escape to find him and ally with him. Unfortunately for her, she was captured and murdered by Antigonid forces. Antigonos gave the tragic Macedonian princess a funeral, but he likely gave the order to murder her in the first place to prevent her from allying with Ptolemy. The other tragedy came unexpectedly from Polyperchon. For some time, Antigonos had kept Basani, Alexander's mistress, and their son Heracles as hostages. He started to spread rumors that it was, in fact, Heracles who was Alexander's heir, and sent him to Polyperchon so he could use them as political props and declare war against Cassander. However, Cassander was about to achieve a grim record, being the man responsible for the murder of most members of Alexander the Great's family. Basani and Heracles arrived in the Peloponnese, but Cassander bribed Polyperchon to join his side. Thus, Polyperchon, under orders from Cassander, murdered the last known heir of Alexander alongside his mother. With the final surviving wife and heir dead, Alexander's line went extinct, and the only remaining Argead, Thessaloniki, was married to Cassander. This is a tragic testament to the lives of women in the classical world, and to the politicking of elite men who used them and their children as political props. All of Alexander's sisters, as well as his wives, did act as political actors, and were it not for the cards stacked against them, they could have been powerful rulers in their own right. As 308 BCE rolled around, Antigonos decided to take the initiative and ordered his son Demetrius to move forward in Greece and assume control of the Hellenic city-states. Moving from Asia Minor, he crossed into the Aegean Sea and then arrived in Athens. He expelled the Macedonian garrisons and the governor Demetrius of Phaleron, and restored the direct democracy the polis is known for. In gratitude, the Athenians began to rebuild their navy and bestowed upon Demetrius and Antigonos a title they were reluctant to even give to Alexander, Thei Satyres, or Saviour Gods. The stage was set for another war to begin. Thus, a new state of affairs arose in the Hellenistic world. The Seleucid Empire, now controlling Persia and Central Asia, was firmly establishing itself, while the Antigonid Empire was still privy to the resources of the Levant and Asia Minor, and the politicking of Ptolemy had made him the master of the seas. At the same time, Polyperchon and Cassander were now allies, and Lysimachos was keen to maintain control of Thrace. With ambitious men seeking to expand their power base in every corner of the Hellenistic world, another war, the Fourth War of the Diadochi, was soon bound to begin. The liberty of the Greek polis was at stake, and without surviving heirs to Alexander, the battle was now a free-for-all deathmatch. The battle to come will be the bloodiest and most chaotic of all. Antigonos and Demetrius were keen to reassert their geopolitical dominance as well as their reputation after their defeat by Seleucus in the Babylonian War, and the renewed alliances amongst the other Diadochi that we covered in the previous episode were the perfect opportunity to achieve this. Thus, they preemptively invaded Greece, taking advantage of the ongoing anti-Macedonian discontent among the Greek polis. Antigonos was acting both for geopolitical reasons and out of a distinctly Macedonian way of conducting war and politics. In a Macedonian martial society that honors strength, militarism, and conquest, Antigonos could not afford to appear weak, and asserting control over Greece was the perfect means to achieve this while weakening Cassander. For their part, Ptolemy and Cassander also had hoped that their support of Seleucus would have the same effect Antigonos was now aiming for against them in Greece. If Seleucus had managed to weaken Antigonos, they could both do overtures and organize against him while he was weak. Thus, the invasion of Greece was both reactive against the other Diadochi and their own attempts to weaken Antigonos, and proactive in achieving a foothold in Hellas. It is also important to understand the state of the empire at the start of the Fourth War, because it determines how the major geopolitical players operate. We cannot know if any of these generals cared about Alexander's legacy until they found out all of his heirs were murdered, except for Cassander, who was perfectly happy murdering most of them. However, by this point it was obvious that the empire was not going to be reunified in Alexander's name, so someone like Antigonus could take his place. Lysimachos, Ptolemy, and Cassander seem to have preferred to have spheres of influence, and perhaps in the case of the first two, enlarging them as much as possible in Asia Minor and Syria respectively. Seleucus probably had ambitions similar to Antigonos as early as now, as he was claiming dream connections to Alexander. Using Alexander's myth would become a major theme in most Hellenistic dynasties, and this was the stage when the Hellenistic kings put themselves at the forefront of it, claiming divine descent and legitimacy from Alexander in order to legitimize their divine rights to rule. Thus, the motivations of each Diadochos, as well as the state of the heirs to Alexander's throne by the start of the Fourth War, meant that the empire was consigned to division and to the conflict that ensued. After his quick success in Athens, the young Demetrius now tried to champion himself as a liberator of Hellas. He used this propaganda strategy to gain favor with the various anti-Macedonian movements in southern Greece. This quickly bore him positive results in the city of Megara. There, the democratic faction sided with him, and this gave him the ability to take over the city and proclaim its freedom, as he had done in Athens. Demetrius also conducted a successful siege in Munichia, where the Democrats fought the 30 tyrants in the aftermath of our Peloponnesian Wars series. This siege was a testing ground for some of his most famous later achievements, but we know almost nothing about it. The consolidation in Attica was a stunning victory for the Antigonids, as they now had a foothold in Greece. Thereafter, the Athenians reconstructed their navy, which was now a loyal ally of the newly deified Antigonid general. Meanwhile, Antigonos' enemy Cassander scrambled with his troops to crush upstart polis that began joining the enemy, for he now had to ensure Greece was under his control before striking back at Antigonos. Having achieved some success in Greece, the Antigonids were finally capable of dealing with the southern front and the scheming Ptolemy. The main target was to be the crossroads of 3 continents, the island of Cyprus, which was probably the most prized possession of the Egyptian Greek kingdom. Demetrius set sail, while his allies began their fight against Cassander and passed through Rhodes, a well-known shipbuilding hub. He asked for their help, but the Rhodians refused, claiming they preferred their neutrality. Thus, Demetrius began his journey toward the island of Aphrodite with only the might of the Antigonid navy on his side. The importance of Cyprus cannot be overstated. It was a springboard into Asia Minor or Egypt due to its location, and was also a key location for naval raids elsewhere. The island's population had only recently had their city kingdoms abolished and been unified as a single province under the Ptolemaic Empire. The island was in the process of becoming a resource hub for timber and copper, and was very diverse, with Greek, Phoenician, Etiocypriot and other peoples living there. The power base of the Ptolemies on the island was the city of Salamis, near modern-day Famagusta. The governor of the island was Ptolemy's brother Menelaos. Thus, the Antigonids made plans to move from Syria and strike at the base of the island in Salamis. Already in possession of 30 Athenian triremes, Demetrios went to his father in Cilicia. There, his army was enhanced with 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, and the navy was also enriched with the bottomless personnel of the Near East. It is estimated that at the dawn of the invasion of Cyprus, the Antigonid navy numbered around 180 warships, consisting of 53 heavy warships and around 110 light vessels. Demetrios took the ships and landed on the Carpathia on the northeast of the island. He proceeded to take over 2 local cities, Carpathia and Orania, leaving his ships at the tip of the peninsula. The Antigonids would have to contend with a large defense force. In his garrison at Salamis, Menelaos had 60 warships alongside 12,000 infantry and 800 cavalry. His strategy was to ensure Demetrios did not reach the city, so he moved out of Salamis and traversed 40 stadia to meet Demetrios in the open field. The tactics that ensued in the battle that followed are unknown to us, but it ultimately ended with the Antigonids triumphing over Menelaos' Ptolemaic host. 1,000 of Menelaos' men were killed and 3,000 were captured, while the remaining troops fled back to Salamis. Demetrios followed them and then put the city under siege. Moreover, the sea was blockaded by the Antigonid ships, trapping the defenders' warships. On land, Demetrios was determined to surpass Alexander's siege of Tyre by using his experience from Munichia. He put forward catapults and 2 battering rams and ordered a siege tower to be built. This siege tower, called the Heliopolis, or Destroyer of Cities, was 9 stories high and took a month to be set up. After it was finished, the siege began. Despite the defense of the Salaminians, the walls were broken down as if struck by lightning. However, Salamis and Menelaos were not afraid of lightning, for their city was famous for the shrines to Zeus. That night they broke out of the walls and burnt down the siege engines, giving the city a brief respite. Demetrios had to regroup before going further. In the west of the island, in the city of Paphos, reinforcements arrived for the Ptolemaic defense force in the form of Ptolemy himself. Ptolemy brought with him 140 warships and 10,000 infantry. From there, he sailed on the southern coast, where Aphrodite once rose from the sea, before ending up in Kition. On the way, he received reinforcements from local allies. He sent a message to Menelaos that he should order the ships out of Salamis and sent them to him, as together there would be too many ships for the Antigonid forces to handle. The strategy Ptolemy expected is unclear, but Menelaos likely tried to exploit some gap in the blockade. However, Demetrios found out about this plan through unknown means and decided to go on the offensive before it could happen. He took his siege equipment, as well as all of his elite troops, and boarded them onto his ship. During the night, he placed them in front of Salamis' harbour, enhancing the blockade's strength. The night passed, and when none of Menelaos' ships emerged from the harbour, Ptolemy realized his plans had been compromised. Thus, he decided to attack Demetrios by himself. Ptolemy took his own armada and sailed out of Kition across Cape Pedalion to face Demetrios. The moment Demetrios saw the Ptolemaic fleet, he ordered 10 of his ships to move to the narrow opening of the harbour and continue the blockade, while he moved with the rest of his fleet to face the attack. The Antigonid heir put his largest and heaviest ships on his own left flank as a double line, with himself on the front of this line. However, realizing his lack of knowledge about naval affairs, he deferred command to a certain Medios of Larissa, an experienced navarch of the Antigonid navy. The center and right flank were put in a single line. Ptolemy responded with a mirror strategy, putting a double line on his own left wing and a single line on his center and right. Both enemies hoped to break their enemy's right first and surround the other ships. After a tense standoff, Demetrios and Medios dashed forward, with the Antigonid left clashing against the Ptolemaic right. Using the siege engines on the ship, the industrious Demetrios easily pounded the enemy and smashed through them. Ptolemy moved quickly as well, advancing his left flank and breaking through the Antigonid right. Meanwhile, the left flank of Demetrios' ships turned starboard and then proceeded to attack the center line of the enemy. The ships of Menelaos began to power through the ships that were conducting the blockade. Ptolemy turned around to rout the Antigonid center, but realized his own fleet had been routed already. Believing it would be too difficult to fight on, he retreated. By the time Menelaos had successfully broken through the blockade, his brother was already gone. The battle for Salamis ended with a decisive Antigonid victory, with 40 warships and 100 supply ships from the Ptolemaic army captured by Demetrios. Menelaos fled from Salamis to Alexandria. Shortly after, the city duly surrendered to Demetrios. 16,000 infantry and 600 cavalry were captured, most of whom joined Demetrios. As for the Antigonid troops, they had minimal losses. Scholars debate the total numbers, but it is likely that only 20 ships were lost. Ptolemy and Menelaos, however, had lost something far more important than the battle. They had lost Cyprus. The island's cities surrendered to Demetrios one by one. Antigonid control over the island was secured for the foreseeable future, providing resources, halloumi, and geographical leeway for the Antigonid dynasty. With Cyprus now firmly in his hands, Antigonos now turned his sights onto Egypt, where he was keen to make gains against Ptolemy, the man who had stolen Alexander's corpse. After receiving his triumphant son, Antigonos broke with the usual rhetoric of protecting the unity of the empire, which by now everyone knew was a farce. Instead, he declared himself king, and named Demetrios both co-king and heir. By doing this, Antigonos made a claim that Alexander's empire belonged to him, and that only he was fit to unify it. The ceremony was elaborate, and caused a domino effect of royal declarations. The multitude then, for the first time, proclaimed Antigonos and Demetrius kings. Antigonus's friends tied at once a diadem round his head, while Demetrius was sent a diadem by his father, and addressed as king in a letter he wrote. When the news was reported, Ptolemy's followers in Egypt also proclaimed Ptolemy king, to dispel any impression that his defeat had humbled his pride. And so emulation spread the practice like a contagion among the Diadochi. Lysimachus began to wear the diadem, and so too did Seleucus in his dealings with the Greeks. As with the barbarians, he had already been behaving as a king. Cassander, however, although the others wrote to him and addressed him as king, continued to write letters in the same style as before, with his name only but no title. The presence of the friends of Antigonos at his coronation was important. Macedonian and later Hellenistic kingship relied on the Phili Basileos, the friends of the king, as a trusted inner circle of administrators. This was the case for Alexander, and it would be the case for their descendants and heirs. It should be noted that Cassander did not also declare himself king, probably because his marriage to Thessaloniki, Alexander's sister, gave him enough legitimacy. Nevertheless, Antigonos's coronation marked a turning point that hastened the war, because now all main actors wanted to be kings of either their respective spheres of influence or the entire empire. The empire was now officially divided, and if it were to reunite, it would be under a new dynasty. Antigonos and Demetrios now had an incredible opportunity. Ptolemy was at a disadvantage, and that meant he was vulnerable. Thus, father and son began to march south for an invasion of Egypt. Antigonos levied 90,000 men on land at his capital, while Demetrios got his ships and set sail. The two sections of the military travelled down south from Asia Minor through the Levant towards Egypt. The border at Gaza was crossed, and Demetrios tried at once to march to the Nile Delta. However, the march was difficult due to the desert landscape, as well as the constant harassment by the old enemies of the Antigonids, the Nabateans, who remembered their previous confrontations in Petra. Eventually, they reached Pelusium, only to find Ptolemy across the river with troops ready to fight them off. Antigonos ordered Demetrios to conduct a landing and make them a bridgehead. Demetrios tried to do so with his best troops twice, once at Pseudonostum and once more at Vatniticum. Both times he was pushed back by Ptolemy. Antigonos considered his options. Attempting to cross the Nile via other means would mean risking failure like Perdiccas, possibly with equally fatal consequences. Thus, he ordered his troops to retreat and moved back to Antigonia. However, this was not to be the end of the war. Demetrios and Antigonos may have ruled Asia Minor and the Levant, but there was a small island that was both neutral and friendly with Ptolemy, the rose of the Dodecanese, Rhodes. Antigonos ordered Demetrios to set sail and conquer the island. Demetrios, who remembered the Rhodians rebuking him, mustered his troops and did so, and it was a choice that would define his very name and bring forth his most infamous title. Throughout the Fourth War of the Diadochi, the Antigonids showed that they would not go down without a fight. With his victory at Salamis, Demetrios had shown that he could bounce back from his previous failures and secure areas for his father's control. In a world where empires rose and fell like ephemeral butterflies, Demetrios and Antigonos wanted theirs to last forever. Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachos and Seleucus also wanted to become immortalized in their dynasties. The struggle was bound to continue even after the Antigonid victory at Salamis. The Fourth War of the Diadochi will thus continue at sea, and many more battles will be fought to end it. The eastern Mediterranean will tremble from the marches of horizon-spanning armies and endless naval armadas. To paraphrase the Italian politician Antonio Gramsci, the classical and Achaemenid worlds are dying, and the Hellenistic world struggles to be born. Now is the time of kings and generals. The city of Rhodes was both a suitable and an unorthodox target for the Antigonids to go after. According to Diadoros Sikelos, it was a very stable and prosperous polis, which was a very important benefit in a very unstable world. This meant that all of the various Diadochi wished to gain control over this rich hub. However, the Rhodians themselves were reluctant to pick a side, and it was in their economic interest to be friends with all but allied with none. With that said, the Rhodians did show slight favour to their biggest trading partner, the Ptolemies. This meant they were prone to avoid open alliances with their enemies, which is why they had denied assistance to Demetrios for the Battle of Salamis in our previous episode. Demetrios thus wanted to take control of this vital nexus point, and by doing so, gain more leverage against Ptolemy. By taking control of the island that was the gateway to the Aegean, and establishing a base of operations upon it, he could dominate the eastern Mediterranean. It was thus a pragmatic choice, though it would cost him in infamy, as attacking the neutral mercantile city made him look like a common pirate to most of the Hellenic city-states. At the port of Lorima, the Antigonid army began assembling under Demetrios. 200 warships were amassed, many pimped up with artillery machines. Additionally, 170 supply ships were loaded up for the over 40,000 troops enlisted to besiege the island city. Diadoros Sikelos claims, perhaps spuriously, that 1,000 smaller pirate ships gathered up behind the Antigonid fleet, waiting like vultures to take advantage of the destruction of Rhodes. Some of these pirates were hired by Demetrios to serve as light raiders. With his army gathered, Demetrios set sail for Rhodes. When news of this reached the Rhodians, they assembled 6,000 of their citizens, 10,000 metics, and an unidentified number of their enslaved population. Their defense force assembled, there was nothing to do but wait until the Antigonid army appeared. When Demetrios' navy arrived upon the island, they blockaded the port of Rhodes completely, while his troops made landfall in the southwest plains. After this, Demetrios sent the pirates to conduct raids across the island, to both irritate and cause damage to the Rhodian population. The Rhodians tried to negotiate at first, but these attempts at diplomacy were fruitless, so they resolved to fight. In a bold move, 3 Rhodian ships broke out from their well-fortified harbour, sank a few of the Antigonid ships, and dashed back to their harbour triumphant. Rhodian craftsmanship had already shown itself to be invaluable. The blockade was never fully successful, as Ptolemaic-funded supplies continued to enter Rhodes, meaning that Rhodes was not alone in its hour of need. The diplomatic connections of the Rhodians further paid off when they sent envoys to Cassander and Lysimachos. Doubling down on the blockade, Demetrius built another harbour alongside a wave breaker to make sure his ships would be secure. Moreover, he loaded up his smaller ships with small artillery and Cretan archers for quick attacks on the Rhodians. He then constructed 2 big platforms on top of 4 warships, united in 2 pairs, and then put his catapults on top of said platforms. He did the same with siege towers on top of platforms strapped on supply ships, thereby building a mobile amphibious siege arsenal. The Rhodians responded by mounting their own artillery on their ships, harbour, walls and mole. With the preparations and the standoff completed, and after bad weather thwarted an initial attack, the battle officially began. Demetrios began his assault at nightfall by sending 500 men to drive at the mole before establishing a beachhead. Leaving 400 men to secure control of the site, he waited until the next morning and then towed his large artillery-mounted ships into the harbour and commenced a projectile assault. The Rhodians weathered this storm with great heroism, returning fire with stubborn resistance. Rhodes suffered heavy losses, but they withstood for the duration of the assault. The Antagonids eventually withdrew, and the Rhodians tried to chase after them and burn the retreating armada, but to no avail. Soon Demetrios regrouped his forces, turned back, and recommenced his assault. This time, through the use of amphibious landings, they established a foothold on the walls. However, the Antigonid forces were eventually repulsed once more. The following week was quiet, as the Rhodians buried their dead, and Demetrios regrouped and reorganized his forces. Demetrios' next move was to escalate the pressure on the defenders with a two-pronged strategy. He took his light ships, full of archers, moved them into close proximity to the defenders' base, and then began to shoot flaming projectiles at the defenders on the Rhodian ships. This was meant to burn the enemy ships and cripple their naval defences. Simultaneously, Demetrios ordered the catapults and artillery to attack the walls, while striking at the enemies on the front ramparts. Soon the walls began to break down, like those of Jericho in the Hebrew Bible, but the sailors on the ships managed to save their vessels from being completely burned. The fate of Rhodes now teetered on a knife's edge, so the defenders resorted to desperate tactics. They took two of their light vessels and made a suicide run towards the siege engine warships, managing to ram and destroy the enemy vessels, sacrificing themselves for the future of their polis, a noble deed equal to that of the 300. However, two engines managed to escape, while the remaining Rhodians were surrounded and captured. Nevertheless, this attack was ultimately successful, for it did enough damage to force Demetrios to retreat. Shortly after, a fierce storm churned up, giving the Rhodians even more breathing room. Consequently, they moved down the mole and destroyed the outpost and the Antigonid troops within, breaking the landing from one side of the island. Soon after, Ptolemaic aid, in the form of 650 troops, entered through the blockade, reinforcing the defenders. As 304 BCE rolled around and Demetrios turned 32 years old, the king of Asia resolved to do one more land assault. Possibly using the remnants from Salamis, he ordered another construction of a helepolis, a giant siege tower. This tower was larger than the ones he had built before and was reinforced with iron front plates to avoid fire attacks. With this monumental achievement in ancient engineering, it was here that Demetrios truly became Polioketes, the besieger of cities. During the construction of the helepolis, the Rhodians scrambled to construct a second wall and reinforce their defences, while also sending their ships to attack enemy supply lines at sea. Multiple ramming assaults took place during the winter, resulting in the Rhodians securing supplies in the form of grain. As this was happening, Demetrios decided to play with fire. He took his team of sappers and began to construct tunnels underneath the outer walls. Upon realizing what was happening, the Rhodians began to dig their own counter-tunnels. As the battle was raging on top, the two tunnels ended up burrowing up against each other and an underground battle ensued. Meanwhile, Demetrios prepared for the ramming assault. He cleared the way for the helepolis, while also building up penthouses for his men to hide in while using battering rams. At some point during this siege, the Rhodians stockpiled their Ptolemaic-supplied ordnance, waited for a dark, moonless night to cover their movements from the enemy, and then barraged the helepolis, damaging it severely but not fully disabling it. Some Athenians in the city tried to negotiate with Demetrios under a man called Athenagoras. Demetrios sent a man named Alexander the Macedonian to meet Athenagoras as a pretext to infiltrate the city, but the Athenian informed the Rhodians of this, who killed him on the spot. The catapults rained stones as the rams approached like massive boars, and the helepolis slowly moved forward by the force of 3,400 soldiers. Eventually, the combined assault collapsed the walls, which came crashing down and caused a Rhodian retreat. The victorious Antagonids passed through, coming face to face with the recently constructed inner walls. In order to break through the inner walls, Demetrius placed his most skilled general, Alkimos, in charge of 1,500 of his most elite troops and ordered them to conduct a night raid on the city. That night, Alkimos and the elite troops broke through into the city and moved inwards with relative ease, confident in their victory. However, as soon as they reached the theatre, the Rhodian defenders descended upon them with the vicious fury of men defending their hometown. After a long and bloody battle, all of the Antigonid troops were either dead or captured. The siege resumed as previously, with Demetrios growing angrier and more impatient than ever. It was here that a message was delivered to him. It was from Antigonus, who was fearful that the dragging out of the siege of Rhodes was severely damaging the Antigonids' reputation. Because of this, Antigonus ordered Demetrios to lift the siege. Despite still having a lot of resources at his disposal, Demetrios begrudgingly accepted and entered into negotiations with the Rhodians. The following settlement was reached. 1. Rhodes would be an autonomous and demilitarized city. 2. Rhodes would be exempt from tribute and continue trade freely. 3. Rhodes was to become an Antigonid ally except against Ptolemy. 4. 100 citizens were to be sent as hostages. With the deal secured, Demetrios sailed away, not defeated, but repelled by a twist of geopolitics. Nevertheless, the Rhodians had defended their homes valiantly despite heavy losses. In the end, the Antigonids did not manage to conquer Rhodes, which was a major propaganda victory for the anti-Antigonid coalition. For the Rhodians, it was a massive success. According to Diodorus Sikellos, the victorious islanders liberated all the enslaved peoples who had fought by their side, as promised. They also built statues of Cassander and Lysimachos in their city. The most important honour, however, was saved for Ptolemy. The Rhodians sent their envoys to the Oracle of Amun, where Alexander was declared the son of Zeus, and asked about it possibly deifying Ptolemy. The oracle gave their blessing, and a large square in the city called Ptolemaium was constructed, a mass complex where Ptolemy was worshipped as a god. This was not an uncommon practice. Indeed, Demetrios was also called a god by the Athenians. The other major legacy of the Siege of Rhodes was architecture, resulting in the construction of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. To commemorate their victory, the Rhodians decided to honour their patron deity, the god of the sun, Helios. Selling the Antigonid equipment left on their island for 300 talents, they instructed a local Rhodian, Chares of Lindos, to construct a massive statue on the site of the harbour. This statue was the famous Colossus of Rhodes, which stood at 33 meters tall. The statue greeted people in the harbour. It was a testament to the power of the sun and a monument for the Rhodians who had fought during their city's finest hour. And what of Demetrios? He was instructed to leave not just for the propaganda issues the siege was causing, but also because the political situation on the Greek mainland was changing. As we will remember from our last episode, many Greek city-states like Athens had aligned with the Antigonids, who claimed to be defending Hellenic freedom from the Macedonian garrisons. However, in retribution for this, Cassander laid siege to the city. This attack was going very badly for Athens, but the news of Demetrios making a landing at Chalcis in northern Attica caused Cassander to reconsider and conduct an orderly retreat. He began to move back towards Macedon, with Demetrios hot on his tail. The two armies ended up meeting in the Kallidromon mountain pass, where, after a battle, 6,000 Macedonians defected to join the cause of the ascendant Polyoketes. Cassander fled with his remaining troops, and his authority in Greece was now on shaky grounds. After this victory, Demetrios turned around and decided to secure his control over southern Greece. He moved down to the Peloponnese, where major Ptolemaic and Cassandrian garrisons were placed, and ordered a full-scale invasion of the Peloponnese. He expelled the enemy troops and then declared the freedom of all Hellenic polis. He was also declared commander of the Hellenes, invoking the pan-Hellenic ideal that Philip and Alexander utilized for their own control over Greece. Everyone to the south of Macedon, except for the ever-isolationist Spartans, accepted him. Demetrios also married a local Molossian princess, Diadomea, securing an alliance between Epiros and the Antigonids. Still licking his wounds, Cassander tried to negotiate for peace with Antigonos, but the one-eyed general demanded that he surrender completely. When the Antigonid reply reached Cassander in 303 BCE, he refused and called on Lysimachos, who was finally free of Thracian attacks. Lysimachos met with Cassander at Pella, and they both sent envoys to Ptolemy and Seleucus to strengthen the dynastic alliance against the combined Hellenic and Asiatic forces of the two saviour gods. Ptolemy accepted the messengers in Alexandria, gleefully obliged the plea for help, and began to prepare for an invasion of Sidon. But the envoys who were meant for Babylon arrived at an inopportune time, for Seleucus was in the east, and thus had to travel further east to reach him. Thus, the alliance against Antigonos was coming together, but it would take some time to be fully formed. However, when it did, it would make all of the eastern Mediterranean tremble. With the failure of the siege of Rhodes and the completion of the Colossus, the sun had finally set on one of the Antigonids' greatest military fumbles. Nevertheless, the Antigonid kingdom remained strong, still spanning all of Syria and Anatolia. However, their enemies were ready for their vengeance. The final battle of the Fourth War of the Diadochi was looming over the horizon, and it is this battle that will shift the fate of the Hellenistic world. The pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy, accepted the envoys coming from the west sent by Lysimachos and Cassander, but Seleucus was not in his capital of Babylon to receive his, for he was off campaigning in the Orient. Seleucus's conquest of the eastern satrapies is little known, but we can surmise that he probably managed to subdue most of Persia, as well as Bactria and Hyrcania. He probably fought a war against Scythian tribes, but the most important of Seleucus's wars was to be fought further east, against a man who would prove to be his equal. That man was the king of Magadha and the founder of the famous Maurya Empire of India, Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta had recently overthrown the last king of the kingdom of Nanda and had accumulated power from the eastern parts of India across the Gangetic Plains and the northwest of the subcontinent. The obscure but possibly titanic Seleucid-Mauryan War lasted from 305 to 303 BCE, and its results are unclear. We know nothing of the campaigns or where they took place, though it is likely the Seleucids crossed the Hindu Kush and were stuck there for the majority of the conflict. No accounts of the battles of this war survive, so anything from Seleucus and Chandragupta fighting in a Greek versus Indian wrestling match, to Megarian, Aristotelian and Platonist philosophers having a mass debate against Buddhists, Jains and Ajivikas are possible. The most likely and disappointing scenario, however, is that the Greeks and Indians merely engaged in multiple bloody and probably indecisive battles. Most historians agree that Seleucus lost this war, resulting in a peace treaty where one of Seleucus's daughters was married to Chandragupta in exchange for the Indian king providing the Macedonian Diadochos with 500 war elephants. Moreover, the Hindu Kush became an unofficial border between the Seleucid and Maurya nations, with the region of Gandhara coming under Mauryan control. Seleucus would later send an ambassador, Megasthenes, to the Mauryan court, and his fragmentary records provide a small insight into Mauryan life and India in general. These two titans of antiquity, one ruling Persia and the other India, thus proved to be more than a match for each other. Armed with his new elephants, and having heard of the news from Cassander's envoys, Seleucus went west to organize and fight Antigonos once more. While Seleucus was on the move, Cassander decided to stay in Greece to guard the southern frontiers of Macedon against Demetrius. Cassander's best general, Pripylos, joined forces with Lysimachos in Byzantium, from where the two commenced a surprise attack into Antigonid territory in Asia Minor. Antigonos heard of this news and amassed his troops. He departed Antigonia, arriving in Asia Minor in 303 BCE and engaging Lysimachos in a stalking game across the northwest of the region. However, the latter eluded the Antigonid until winter, when both armies stopped to endure the cold weather. In the south and the east, two new events unfolded. In the south, Ptolemy had entered Phoenicia by sea and land and began a little attested siege of the city of Astarte, Sidon. In the east, Seleucus appeared from the lands of Ahura Mazda and, in a lightning bolt march, united with Lysimachos. While Ptolemy retreated after hearing rumors that Lysimachos and Seleucus had been defeated, Antigonos got wind of the arrival of Seleucus and immediately asked Demetrius to come to his aid. The besieger obliged and traveled across the Aegean, powering through the region and recapturing coastal cities on his way to meet his father at Kyllene. Father and son then met and marched forth to face their enemies. After maneuvers that we sadly know little about, the two armies met at Ipsos in Phrygia in 301 BCE. The time had finally come to see who was the greatest general. Before long, the generals entered the battlefield, which was located somewhere around Ipsus. The Antigonids had amassed 70,000 infantry, mainly of the heavy type. Placing them in the center alongside mercenaries, Antigonos put his son Demetrius on the right wing, alongside 5,000 cavalry and a certain Pyrrhus of Epiros, who later would immortalize himself by invading a fledgling Roman Empire and coining the term Pyrrhic victory through his extremely costly triumphs. The one-eyed general moved to the left flank alongside 5,000 more cavalry, while placing 75 elephants and light infantry in alternating positions in front of the center. Seleucus and Lysimachus placed their heavy infantry of 64,000 in the center, combining both Greek and Asian troops from all over the Seleucid realm. 7,500 cavalry were deployed both on the right and left flanks of their army, while Seleucus put some of his elephants at the front. The rest of the elephants were left behind as a reserve force. Interestingly, Seleucus had brought his 23-year-old son, Antiochus, alongside him to fight in the left wing of the Macedonian cavalry. The elephants on both sides released a deafening trumpeting din as they both began to charge forward. The infantry in the center of both alliances pushed behind them in slow, methodical movements. Demetrius took the initiative on the right wing and charged forward towards the enemy cavalry. It proved to be a quick fight, with Antiochus forced to retreat with Demetrius behind him. Thereafter, both cavalry formations left the battlefield. Meanwhile, the cavalries on the other side of the battlefield had also engaged, but in the center, the Antigonid infantry had managed to inflict heavy losses on the Seleucid Lysimachian middle. Demetrius continued chasing Antiochus, but eventually turned around to attack Seleucus from behind. However, Seleucus was not to be so easily defeated. He ordered his reserve elephants to move into position, which they did, blocking the path of the besieger. Try as he might, Demetrius could not get around the elephants. Then Seleucus took the light cavalry and ordered them to move around the center formation and move onto the right flank of the Antigonid infantry, where Antigonus had been exposed after Demetrius' assault on the right. Now the light cavalry moved to fill that gap. They raised their javelins and threw them at the heavy infantry, which soon began to collapse. Pushing through the now chaotic center, Seleucus moved to the left, where Antigonus was with his cavalry. Despite the difficult situation he was in, Antigonus remained in the field of battle, never retreating and remaining hopeful that his son would return and help him. Thus, he perished in the place he'd spent most of his life, on the battlefield, as a field of javelins struck both him and his faithful companions. Antigonus was a truly ambitious man, skilled in the art of war, and managed to survive facing overwhelming odds. He tried to reunite Alexander's empire at the age of 80 years old, and he had nearly achieved this goal many times. He also had a living legacy, his son Demetrius, who had proven himself to his father many times over. When Demetrius realized his father had perished, he retreated from the battlefield and the Battle of Ipsus ended. The Battle of Ipsus marked the official end of the Wars of the Diadochi, though the true end would come a few decades later, with the end of the first generation of dynasts. Antigonus' death was an important turning point. He had conducted some of the early Hellenistic state-building practices, like founding cities, settling Greeks, and engaging with local rulers. While some of the surviving ancient sources are hostile towards the Antigonids, many modern scholars, like Richard Billows, have shown that he was, in fact, not just power-hungry, but keen on statecraft. After his death on the battlefield, Antigonus' body was sent to Demetrius, who gave his beloved father a royal burial worthy of the Lord of Asia. Now his empire was to be divided amongst the victors. Lysimachus, who was too busy with raids and internal Adrician revolts in his kingdom for most of the duration of the wars, now received most of Asia Minor. Seleucus took what is today's Syria and Kurdistan, while Ptolemy took Palestine. This left out a few small regions, which were nonetheless strategically important. These included Cyprus, some Aegean islands, and southern Greece. It is noteworthy that Cassander got very little in terms of spoils, because while defeated, Demetrius still had sway over the Greek polis. His brother, Pleistarchus, did receive parts of Cilicia that were under allied control. However, the Antipatrids were not left to be alone by the gadfly that was Demetrius the Besieger. the Antigonid king had fled to Ephesus, and then most likely to Cyprus, before trying to go back to Athens. Up until now, Athens had been glad to be in alliance with Demetrius, the man who had restored democracy in their city. However, Athenian support for the man was starting to wane, for after the partition of the Antigonid realm, the merchants of the city had now lost access to supplies from Asia Minor. Thus, according to Plutarch, they sent him a delegation to say he was not to be allowed back. Demetrius instead settled in Delos and began to organize once more. Having moved back to Greece and secured his control of the region once more, he began to conduct raids against Lysimachos, eventually achieving a hold over the Asia Minor coast. Demetrius became strong enough to be considered for various martial alliances that the successors would become known for. One of these alliances came from Seleucus, who now owned the heartland of his father's former possessions. Seleucus had an issue with Ptolemy's presence in Palestine and Phoenicia, so the Greek pharaoh and the Hellenic Shahanshah broke off their diplomatic relations. This was a schism that the besieger sought to exploit. The dating is unclear, but it was likely in 299 BCE that Demetrius sent his daughter Stratonike, who was named after Demetrius' own mother, to become one of the wives of Seleucus. Later, Seleucus passed Stratonike on to his son Antiochus. This political marriage signaled that Demetrius was still strong, and that Seleucus no longer saw him as a mortal enemy. Demetrius' other wife, Diadomea, had also died of illness, so his alliance with Pyrrhus was beginning to lose ground. As Seleucus began to form yet another phase of independent foreign policy, Ptolemy sought to maintain an alliance with the now closely bound Lysimachos and Cassander. Thus, the former sent two of his daughters to marry Lysimachos and his son and heir Agathocles. We must remember when discussing this that Macedonian kings practiced polygyny, the custom of marrying multiple women. So for instance, Seleucus' wife Apama could have stuck around if she was still alive, though scholars debate whether this was the case. As alliances were being brokered, Demetrius began to raid into Ptolemaic territory. Eventually, overtures began to be made for a possible marriage alliance with Ptolemy, only to be ratified a decade later. As Hellenistic alliances were prone to shift, Demetrius and Seleucus soon began not to see eye to eye, possibly because it was seen as a short-term alliance. However, the boost to the besieger was enough for him to take advantage of a major event. In 297 BCE, Cassander died of dropsy, likely because of a sustained equine lifestyle. The man known for both his cunning in ascending to the Macedonian throne and for killing the most members of Alexander's family had perished. The key to Cassander's successes had been his ability to forge alliances and survive against difficult odds, much like his rival Demetrius. Cassander had three sons, Philip IV, Antipater I, and Alexander V, all born by the last survivor of the Argead dynasty, Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki initially seems to have remained influential, but soon her sons started to bicker over who would rule. Philip ruled briefly as the eldest heir, but died soon after. Following his passing, Antipater, the middle son, began to argue with the youngest sibling, Alexander V, over the succession. In 295 BCE, Antipater murdered his mother Thessaloniki, the sister of Alexander the Great. The reason for this matricide is unclear, but Thessaloniki had been ruling as regent in the wake of her husband's death, and thus may have had influence in the court that Antipater wanted to avoid. The last of Alexander the Great's siblings was now dead. Thessaloniki had lived to see her whole family perish, but was also ambitious herself, ruling alongside Cassander. She was thus as shrewd as her husband and her siblings, and is remembered today as the namesake of the second largest city in Greece, and for the legends of her as a mermaid who still lives, seeking her brother across the seas. A civil conflict emerged in the heartland of Macedon between the two princes, and Alexander V decided to do something rather unexpected. As Antipater was betting on being allied to Lysimachos and his Thracian troops, the youngest son invited Demetrius, the man whose dynasty his family had fought against, to come to Macedon and assist him. Demetrius was more than happy to oblige and enter this conflict by beginning a march to Macedon. However, he was not just doing this to help Alexander, but to ensure he himself would rule. In 294 BCE, in the city of Larissa, Demetrius proclaimed himself king in front of his troops. He had the legitimacy to do this through his first wife, the Macedonian daughter of Antipater, Phila, mother of both Stratonike, the wife of Seleucus, and the heir to Demetrios, Antigonus II Gonatas. He moved to Pella, took the region with relative ease, and then proceeded to murder Alexander V. Following this, Antipater I fled to Thrace and into the arms of Lysimachus, where he would be murdered years later. As all of the Diadochi were in general peace at the time, and as the Macedonians had grown dissatisfied with the bickering Antipatrids, they all accepted the kingship of Demetrios. This was to be the first of the Antigonid kings to rule over Macedon for a century. But Demetrios was not ready to stop there. He immediately began preparations to march down south once again, and, like the lightning bolt of Zeus, strike at the polis of Hellas that had dared to defy him. The death of Antigonos spelled the end of the Antigonid Empire in Asia Minor, which was now divided between Lysimachus, Ptolemy and Seleucus. Cassander was secure in his position in Macedon until his death. The Fourth War of the Diadochi had ended with the defeat of one of the most powerful armies in both Europe and Asia. However, there are still a few loose ends to tie up. One of them is Demetrios, who was still at large and would not give up on his dynastic dreams. The other will be rather unexpected, but will revolve around the phantom of the successors, Lysimachus. This successor will find himself in an unexpected situation, as his neighbourhoods, Asia Minor and Macedon, will become more unstable as the century turns. This turmoil will bring him into contact with Epirot kings like Pyrrhus, and will have him face off against Seleucus, who now wished to become the new Antigonus. After securing the throne of Macedon, Demetrios began making moves to consolidate his rule. In 294 BCE, when he heard that Lysimachus had been taken captive by the Thracian Getae tribe while campaigning in Getae lands, he set off to take Thrace. However, before Demetrios reached the region, messengers told him that Lysimachus had been freed, so he turned back to deal with a revolt by the Boeotians and the Thessalians, who had taken advantage of his leave to rise in rebellion against him. Demetrios managed to put down these rebellions by laying siege to Thebes. This exposed his Thessalian territories and allowed Pyrrhus to invade, but Demetrios managed to expel the Epirot king as well. After taking Thebes, Demetrios founded a city called Demetria, and then married Lenassa, the Syracusan ex-wife of Pyrrhus. This marriage represented a further decline in the relationship between Epirus and Macedon. After stabilizing his Greek territories, Demetrios returned once more to Athens, which was now eager to accept the resurgent regional hegemon with garlands. In order for the democratic city to accept a king, they revived the idea that Demetrios was a god, depicting him as a son of Poseidon in connection to his naval supremacy in battles like Salamis. After securing Athens' obedience, Demetrios returned to Macedon, before descending south once again, this time to Aetolia. This further escalated tensions between himself and the Pyrrhic king of Epirus, who saw Demetrios as encroaching on his sphere of influence. The fighting with Aetolia and later with Epirus ended in 290 BCE with a peace treaty. This, however, did not mark the end of the conflict in the Greek mainland. In 289 BCE, Demetrios fell ill, and then faced another invasion by Pyrrhus, which he managed to repel. However, in 288 BCE, Lysimachus and Pyrrhus, with help from Ptolemy, decided to finish things and invaded Macedonia with an overwhelming force, splitting it between them and forcing Demetrios to flee. Demetrios fled south with his family to Greek territories that they hoped would remain theirs. Over the despair of watching her beloved husband face defeat, his first wife, Phila, took poison and died, a devastating loss for a man who had already lost much of his family in these wars. Seeing Demetrios' foundation of power dissolving beneath him, the fickle citizens of Athens revolted against him once more, and Demetrios responded by besieging the city. The Athenians held on until Pyrrhus arrived to assist them, forcing Demetrios to flee once more. Even after these strings of defeats, Demetrios was always seeking another fight, so he left his southern Greek possessions to his son Antigonus II in Corinth and went to Asia Minor to seize control over Lysimachus' territories. Our record here becomes very sparse, as Plutarch provides us with little detail of any battles that occurred during these campaigns. It seems that initially Demetrios was successful against Lysimachus' son Agathocles, and was negotiating with various successors. However, while recovering from illness in the city of Catalonia, he was ambushed by Seleucus. Demetrius tried to get out of the region, but he was blocked by the Seleucid forces and fled to the city of Cehestica, hoping to stir up a rebellion against Seleucus there. When this failed, he moved to Afrin for a final battle, and then tried to attack Seleucus under cover of night, but the commotion in the enemy camp caused fear in the troops and compelled them to retreat. A fight ensued the next day, but when Seleucus proclaimed that any Antigonid troops would receive pay and safety if they went over to his side, many of Antigonos' mercenaries defected to the enemy. Demetrius once more turned tail with what few allies he had left, but there was no escape. Hiding in a forest, Demetrius unsheathed his sword to commit suicide, but his friends prevented him from doing so. Instead, he surrendered to Seleucus, who treated him with royal honours. Despite his request for a small realm to rule, he was sent to the Chersonese, where he lived, hunted, and exercised in royal parks with his allies. In his mercy, Seleucus allowed Demetrius to live, despite calls by Lysimachus to have him executed. The reason for Demetrius' survival, according to Plutarch, is Stratonike, now married to her ex-stepson Antiochus I Soter. Antigonus II begged, alongside many Antigonid city officials, to surrender everything to Seleucus in exchange for the freedom of the besieger. However, it was not to be, and Demetrius abdicated the throne. His son would continue his dynasty with great honour. Demetrius sank into depression and alcoholism, dying in 282 BCE. Demetrius was ambitious, if at times reckless. However, he was shrewd and very brave on many occasions, and truly lived up to his father's name. The Antigonids were strong because of Demetrius, and their tactical skills would appear many times over the next century. Antigonus received his father's ashes in a gold urn and gave him a royal burial in Demetrius. After the neutralization of Demetrius, the web of alliances between the surviving Diadochi began to shift once again, beginning when Ptolemy died in 282 BC in Alexandria of natural causes. This was a rare event for a general of Alexander, as most died in court intrigue or battle, as we've seen. Ptolemy II Philadelphos succeeded his father's pharaonic throne. Ptolemy I, whose title was Soter, meaning saviour, was a man who preferred to work in his sphere of influence, and was always keen on securing it. This drove a lot of his foreign policy, though as his occupation of Phoenicia shows, he could also be an expansionist. His Ptolemaic dynasty would rule for centuries, initially being steadfastly proud of their Hellenism and rejecting the customs of the native Egyptians they ruled over, but slowly incorporating pharaonic and Egyptian elements in their rule over time. After Ptolemy's death, relations between the most powerful actors in the Hellenistic world were tense, but it was court intrigue in Lysimachus' Thrace that sparked the embers over the dry kindling. The polygamous king's new wife was Arsinoe, daughter of Ptolemy. Since marrying Lysimachus, she had borne 3 heirs that were lagging in the line of succession behind Agathocles, who was the son of Lysimachus and Nicaea, daughter of Antipater. Lysimachus, who was in his 70s alongside most of the surviving Diadochi, was informed by his younger wife Arsinoe that Agathocles was conspiring against him. We do not know if this was true, or if Arsinoe was lying to secure her son's presence on the Greco-Thracian throne, but both could have been true. Consequently, Lysimachus murdered his son, as well as many of his allies in the court. This caused a mass exodus of the Agathoclean faction, including Agathocles' wife Lysandra, who was also of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and a certain Ptolemy Karaunos, who was her brother. Karaunos was a candidate for the Ptolemaic throne, but had fled after Philadelphos became the favourite. This faction of the court fled to Persia to seek refuge with Seleucus. Through their arrival, Seleucus saw an incredible opportunity to expand his realm, and perhaps make it as great as that of Alexander. However, we are unsure of the Greek Shahinshah's true ambitions. As the instability in Lysimachus' court began to spread to the rest of the empire, his possessions in Asia Minor, like Pergamon, began to drift away from Lysimachus' grip. It was because of this that Seleucus decided to invade the region in 281 BCE. The old general left Antiochus I Soter to rule in his stead in Asia, and then moved on from Babylonia and into Asia Minor. In Pergamon, Seleucus was received by Philetaerus, a lieutenant in charge of the city's considerably wealthy treasury. Seleucus accepted him as a vassal. Thereafter, the region slowly gained independence as the famous Kingdom of Pergamon, ruled by the Attalid dynasty. The campaign was fast. Seleucus easily took some of Asia Minor, causing Lysimachus to rally his troops and move into the peninsula to drive out his foe. The two armies met in the Battle of Kouropedion near Sardis in the winter of 282 to 281 BCE. Virtually nothing is known about this battle other than that it was a resounding victory for Seleucus, and that Lysimachus died in the battle. The final strike is recorded as having come by a Heraclean soldier called Malanos. After Lysimachus' demise, Seleucus was now the undisputed grand champion of the wrestling match that was the Wars of the Diadochi. He thus crossed the Hellespont and went into Greece for the first time in decades. He was in his 20s when he left, and like Antigonus and Ptolemy, he had made his home amongst foreigners he ruled over. Seleucus' goal was to move into Macedon and take control of it, but then lightning struck in the form of Ptolemy Karaunos. Ptolemy organized an assassination attempt and murdered Seleucus, killing the last of the Diadochi and dawning the age of the Epigoni, or the heirs of the successors. Seleucus had proven himself to be a prudent ruler, which had secured his rule over Babylon and then Persia. He was also tactically brilliant, as his successes in the east show. His dynasty, the Seleucids, ruled most of the Hellenistic world and hybridized Greek and Persian cultures like no other, before slowly withering away. After eliminating Seleucus, Ptolemy Karaunos went to Macedon with a diadem and then declared himself king. But his luck would soon run foul. The story behind these Celtic invasions is one of the most interesting and unexpected aspects of the early Hellenistic period. As we have shown in our Alexander series and Balkan peoples videos, the Balkan region north of Hellas was an accumulation of various tribal confederacies and kingdoms during this period, like the Thracians, Dacians, and Illyrians. On the northern edges of the Balkans, some Celtic tribes had been living for centuries and were in mercantile contact with their southern neighbours. On occasion, they would even make contact with Greek rulers, like when they sent an embassy to Alexander the Great after he subdued a Thracian revolt. During the 3rd century BCE, the Celts began to move southward in organized numbers, exploiting the weakness of people like the Illyrians due to their constant fighting with the Greeks. We do not know why they chose to move southward in such organized numbers, but the reasons were likely the same as those of Greek colonists during the Archaic period in the 8th to 6th centuries BCE, the need to relieve population pressure and wealth. Thus, from the regions of Moravia, they moved first to Illyria, where they defeated some Illyrian tribes, as well as to Dacia, where they also achieved both victories and defeats. Eventually, in 310 BCE, a daring Celtic general called Molostomos tried to push deep inside Illyria and subdue the entire region, but an organized Dardanian force defeated him. Cassander was following the situation with some care to his north, despite the constant wars with the Greek polis. Thus, he set up a treaty with the Illyrians to assist them in the event of a crisis. One more attempt was made by the Celts in 298 BCE, this time through Thrace, but here too they were defeated by Cassander himself. Some of the remnants of the Celts ended up in the Serdica region, where they set up a settlement that would one day become the illustrious capital of Bulgaria, Sofia. By the time when Lysimachus' kingdom collapsed due to the dynastic struggles, some Celtic raiders saw the opportunity to try to settle further south. In 281 BCE, they made some initial overtures, but withdrew due to a lack of numbers. In 180 BCE, some Celtic elites amassed 85,000 men and moved from the lands of Pannonia for a large-scale expedition. They split into 3 large divisions aimed at attacking all 3 major hubs of the Balkans. One leader, Carethrios, was successful against the Thracians. Another, under the leaders Brenos and Achikorios, were dispatched to Paeonia. A commander named Bulgios moved towards Illyria and Macedon. The first 2 contingents seemed to have been successful, but Bulgios had a more interesting combat tour. In Macedon, Seleucus' killer, Ptolemy Karaunos, had just assumed control of Macedon and was determined to keep it. Thus he moved with his forces to meet Bulgios in battle. We know little of this battle, but we know that Ptolemy was not only defeated but decapitated, and his head was put on a spike as a trophy. Bolgios would have moved further south and plundered more, but he was defeated by a Macedonian named Sosthenes. Sosthenes was then defeated by Brenos, who had defeated the Paeonians and had moved south. The Celtic general plundered much of northern Greece and returned to the north triumphant. Emboldened by this victory, the generals began preparations to try one more invasion of Greece. In 279 BCE, Brenos amassed a large number of Celts and began to march down into Greek territory. Our source, Pausanias, claims that the army included 152,000 infantry and 24,000 cavalry, although he clarifies that as each horseman had 2 grooms, the real number was 61,200 men. Alongside him was Achikorios, and the two were confident that they could repeat their previous successes in rampaging through Greece. During that time, Macedon was still in turmoil, as Demetrius' son, Antigonos II Gonatas, was not in the country and would only come to the throne in 276 BCE. Thus, it fell to the Hellenic polis to try to manage the defense of their territories deep in the south of Hellas. As the Celts passed through Macedon with ease, an alliance of southern Greek forces merged to try and stop them upon hearing of their raids into Thessaly. The Athenians sent 500 cavalry and 1,000 infantry, as well as warships, under General Kallippos. The Boeotians sent 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, commanded by Kephisodotus, Theodoras, Diogenes, and Lysander. Megara sent 700 soldiers, while Phocas sent 500 cavalry and 3,000 infantry under Critobulus and Antiochus. The Locrians also sent 700 infantry under Midias. Alongside them were 500 mercenaries from Macedon, hired by Antigonus II and commanded by Aristodemos the Macedonian, and 500 from Seleucid Syria, hired by Antiochus I Soter and under the command of Tilisarchos. The Greeks decided to block off the famous pass at Thermopylae, where their ancestors had fought the Persians before, and where the Lamian War's famous battle took place at the start of this video. They also sent 1,000 light infantry to stop the Celts in the nearby river Sperchios by blowing up the local bridges. However, Brenos waited until nightfall and sent a contingent of his men to swim across the river through the nearby marshes by using their shields as rafts or walking through. The Greeks realized this and then retreated back to the Thermopylae Pass. Brenos ordered a bridge to be built, moved to the nearby city of Heraclea, and promptly besieged it. The Aetolians defended the city, for it had been forced into their league the year before. Thus, Brenos packed up his troops before turning towards Thermopylae. He reached the passes, much like Xerxes had before him, and initiated an attack at dawn. The Greeks moved tactically and silently forward, and engaged with the Celtic infantry in close-range combat, while the Celtic cavalry had to wait in the rear. According to Pausanias, the Celts were disorganized, though this may be his prejudice against non-Hellenes talking. The Greek light infantry also shot arrows and slingshots at the enemy, causing many casualties on the first day. Many Celts were said to continue fighting even after being hit by arrows or spears. At the same time, the Athenian warships bombarded the enemy from the Malian Gulf nearby, causing even more damage. The Celts eventually decided to retreat in tatters. The end of the day saw many Celts die, as they had little in terms of body armor besides their shields. Pausanias claims only 40 Greeks died, and that the Celts didn't come for their dead. Brenos then devised a plan to terrorize the Aetolian countryside and force the Aetolian contingent to leave. He sent 40,000 infantry and 800 cavalry that crossed through southern Greece into Aetolia, where they began to rampage and commit mass atrocities. The Aetolians left Thermopylae and followed suit. One city, Callion, was brutally destroyed before they could arrive. However, when they did arrive, they joined forces with their wives, who were said to fight more furiously than them, and managed to inflict a victory so decisive that half of the Celtic contingent was destroyed. Back in Thermopylae, the battle continued until Brenos discovered the path the Persians had crossed centuries before. Taking 40,000 men, he moved into the pass and used a misty day to surprise the Greeks. The Phocians, who were guarding the pass, did not realize the onslaught until it was too late. They fought off the Celts valiantly until they retreated. By the time Brenos crossed the pass, the rest of the Greeks had departed. Brenos then set his eyes on Delphi, Greece's most important oracle, with a large amount of wealth. Here, Pausanias' account is full of fanciful tales, so we will have to tread carefully with our description. The Celts, whose army was likely the remnants of the existing force, arrived in the city of Delphi and caused the terrified locals to flee to the oracle. Upon hearing of the onslaught of the Gauls, an indeterminate number of Phocians, as well as 1,200 Aetolians under Philomelos, arrived to defend the city. The battle's formations are unknown to us. Pausanias takes time to describe legends of local heroes from mythology appearing to help the Hellenes, as well as a blizzard that caused fear amongst the Celts. In the morning, the Phocians, who understood the terrain, climbed around the snowy hills of Mount Parnassos and began to shoot volleys at the Celts from the rear. The Celts were caught off guard. They fought valiantly against both fronts, but eventually Brenos was wounded by a javelin, causing chaos amongst the troops. The disorderly retreat led the Celts back to Spercheios, while they suffered 6,000 casualties. They camped at night near the river, while they met with Echikorios, who had stayed in the region of Thermopylae. But according to Pausanias, a panic took over them during the evening, and they began to kill each other. This is ascribed to the god Pan, but the fact that the Celts thought their enemies spoke Greek suggests that there might be some sort of psychological warfare by the Hellenes. 10,000 Celts were killed during this panic, and Brenos drank undiluted wine and died. Under threat of savage Aetolian attacks, the remaining Celts packed up and left. The remaining Celts moved to Thrace and settled there for a while. By 277 BCE, they were bound to face the wrath of an Antigonos, the ascending Antigonos II Gonatas. During this time, the son of Demetrius was biding his time to try to take over the throne of Macedon, while Sosthenes had taken over the regency of Ptolemy Karaunos. Antigonus sailed towards the Hellespont to try to cross into Hellas. Celts settled the territory of their landing, and the Greeks were determined to defeat them. The Celts were somewhat organized and were under the command of Kerethrios, one of Brenos' generals. They saw the Greeks land and so prepared themselves to attack them. However, Antigonus was prepared and devised an ambush. He left his camp and hid in the surrounding region. When the Celts attacked and rampaged through the camp, the Greeks bided their time and then pounced, causing a mass slaughter of the remaining Celts. We know little of this battle, but in a typical pattern, the Celts were said to be defeated in the presence of the ghosts of Greek heroes. This, alongside the outlandish claims of Greek authors that Celts were either bloodthirsty monsters or just unintelligent guerrillas, makes describing these battles difficult. What we do know is that the Celts were soundly defeated, and that their remnants stayed in Thrace and were slowly Hellenized. Antigonus would fail at first against Sosthenes, but would finally achieve victory a year later in 276 BCE. Meanwhile, some remnants of the Celts ended up in Asia Minor, where they rampaged freely until they faced Antiochus I in 275 to 269 BCE in the Battle of the Elephants. The only thing we know about this battle is that the Celts panicked upon seeing elephants for the first time and were soundly defeated. The survivors managed to survive with various alliances until they settled around Ankara in the 230s BCE, and they founded the Kingdom of Galatia, a Gaulo-Hellenistic polity in the heart of cosmopolitan Asia Minor. The Antigonids returned to the throne of Macedon and ruled until the Romans conquered Greece, something we have discussed in our previous series. The new era had finally been born, the Hellenistic Age. While the official end of the Wars of the Diadochi was the Battle of Kouropedion, there were many more wars amongst the successor dynasties. We have already discussed the wars that occurred in Greece and Anatolia in many of our other long-form series, which you should check out. There are also almost no sources on the wars that occurred when the Greco-Bactrian kingdom seceded from the Seleucids. This leaves a series of wars that are seldom mentioned but are very interesting, despite the sometimes sparse sources, the Syrian Wars between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties on and off from 274 BCE to 168 BCE. These occurred mostly in the Near East and caused much havoc in the dynastic politics of both empires. Syria, with its economic might and large cultural and agricultural hubs, was bound to be the center of the conflict, as both large empires were going to fight over the region. The roots of the war can be seen as early as 301 BCE, when Syria was divided between Seleucus and Ptolemy. Neither side was ready to really wage a war over the Levant, because they both had personnel issues and their empires were not fully consolidated yet. It is also the case that the Greek colonists that often assisted both dynasties had only just begun to arrive, and thus their military numbers were still small. Ptolemy had acquired Palestine and Coele Syria, while the north was under Seleucus' control, and both began to send settlers into their respective regions and build settlements to consolidate their control in the Greek manner. Seleucus had hoped to gain Coele Syria, but was unable to do much in military terms, thus allowing the status quo to solidify. Seleucus built cities in Iraq, western Iran and Syria, bringing Greeks in and trying to accommodate some local elites. Meanwhile, Ptolemy invested in retaking Cyprus, something he did in 294 BCE. Eventually, the two kings died, and their sons, Ptolemy II and Antiochus I, took over. The two sons were more determined to try to fight for Syria and secure the Fertile Crescent for their empires. A sort of Cold War occurred in southern Asia Minor between the two, as Ptolemy II tried to stir up trouble and gained some influence in the region. At the same time, Antiochus was trying to consolidate the massive Seleucid realms fully. In 274 BCE, a war began between the two empires over Syria. This war is not well attested, but we have a few clues as to what occurred. It seems that Antiochus began to penetrate into Syria's south, in response to a confident onslaught by Ptolemy II. The Ptolemaic first strike must have been fast, but no major cities appear to have been sacked. Antiochus' counterstrike must have been well manned, as it seems to have pushed into Ptolemaic Syria. Ptolemy had control of the seas, which assisted him in having steady supply lines, but he is also described as being in the Nile Delta overseeing defences, suggesting that the Seleucids arrived deep into the Sinai. Another aspect of the war was the incursion of the Cyrenaean king Magus. Cyrene was a kingdom in modern-day Libya with Greek kings, and Magus' mother had married into the Ptolemies. Thus, as a pretender to the throne, Magus invaded Egypt in 274 BCE, but the Hellenistic pharaoh pushed him back. Eventually, a stalemate was formed. The Seleucids were pushed out, and some Ptolemaic influence over southern Anatolia was formed. The Ptolemies claimed victory, and their endurance can be said to be a victory of sorts. Ptolemy II managed to strengthen his rule, while the Seleucids were on more shaky ground. We know nothing of the peace, but it seems that both leaders honoured a pledge to not attack each other. This pledge held until 260 BCE. In the meantime, Ptolemy II managed to project some of his power in Greece by sending fleets to the Black Sea for incursions. As Ptolemy was busy in the Kouropedion War, Antiochus was building up his kingdom's military might. The two kingdoms continued in their arms race, each side conquering surrounding regions like the expedition of Ptolemy II into Nubia and its partial colonization, and the Seleucid incursions into Asia Minor. In 260 BCE, with the death of Antiochus I, his son Antiochus II reached an alliance with Antigonus Gonatas. The two kings had common interests. Antigonus wanted to get rid of Ptolemy in the Kouropedion War, while Antiochus II held Ptolemy responsible for turmoil in Pergamon. Thus, the war was initiated in Asia Minor. This is the war of which we know the least. What we do know is that the war started in Ephesus. There were battles on two fronts. In Ionia, where local polis were fought over by the two powers and Antigonos, and in Syria, where more conventional warfare took place. The Ptolemies, if archaeological hoards hidden in haste are to be believed, must have rampaged through southern Anatolia and have even threatened coastal cities like Antioch. In Ionia, Rhodes defeated the Ptolemies at Ephesus in 258 BCE, and also in Kos sometime between 261 and 255 BCE. Ptolemy managed to instigate a revolt in Corinth in 253 BCE, breaking off the Macedonian involvement, and then managed to negotiate peace via a marriage alliance. The Ptolemies had lost territory in Asia Minor, but had decided to achieve peace by sending Ptolemy's daughter, Berenike Syria, to be married to Antiochus II. To marry Berenike, Antiochus even annulled his marriage to Laodike, a Greek noblewoman from Asia Minor. Ptolemy II was left in Egypt to lick his wounds and reconsolidate his rule, renewing treaties and visiting local oracles to gain political favour. He seemed determined to regain what he had lost, and he was willing to bide his time to do so. He would not live to see it, as he died in 246 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Ptolemy III Euergetes. However, in Seleucid Persia, things were continuously unstable. Revolts in Bactria and Chorasmia were paving the way for the rising suns of the Greco-Bactrian and the Parthian empires. Antiochos seemed more concerned with his Anatolian and Syrian territories, but he died in 247 BCE. This may have been via poisoning from his former wife Laodike, who was furious at being repudiated. However, Antiochos was moving back to the realms he had given her after annulling their marriage, so she used this to try to get her son on the throne. Thus, the power vacuum was left to both Laodike and Berenike's Syria and their sons over who was to rule. Berenike had one ace up her sleeve. Her brother was the pharaoh of Egypt. Thus, she called him to her aid, and the Third Syrian War, or the Laodicean War, began. Ptolemy III launched an offensive via sea and land, and tried to reach the enemy territory. Various small skirmishes occurred, such as a Seleucid raid in Sully in Cyprus, and the stealing of treasures from the Acropolis there. By the time Ptolemy arrived at his landing spot near Antioch, termed Seleucia in Perea, his sister had been assassinated. This is despite her cultivating circles amongst the elites of Antioch, but it seems Laodike was a fierce political operator. Ptolemy was thus in a precarious situation. He had to try to narrow his focus to the royal succession line and try to garner local support, as there was no indication people wished to be conquered by the Ptolemies at this time. Laodike organized the coronation of her son Seleucus II, and then coalesced her forces together. Meanwhile, the Ptolemies were negotiating with pro-Berenikean forces to try and fight off the Laodicean partisans. Upon hearing of the coronation, and due to threats of sedition in Egypt, Ptolemy sent off an order for his allies to evacuate northern Syria while approaching governors in Cilicia. Meanwhile, Seleucid forces marched on Hellespont to break off the region from being accessible to the Ptolemies, who had been active in the region. This seems to have been a failure, as the Seleucid navy was shipwrecked in the Hellespont. Then the Ptolemies went on the offensive. Many commanders, including the half-brother of Ptolemy III, Ptolemy Andromacho. The Navarch moved across Asia Minor and gained control of coastal towns like Ephesus. He was, however, defeated by the Seleucid ally Antigonos Gonatas in the Battle of Andros, with Ptolemy escaping to Ephesus and the Cyclades being lost. Back in the Orient, the Ptolemies were ravaging Syria and taking over lots of territory, with the famous Xanthippos of Carthage as a possible commander of these forces. The Seleucids were also in tatters. Laodike had forced Seleucus II to co-rule with his brother Antiochos Hyrax, or the Hawk, and the latter was causing trouble. While Seleucus had recovered some territories, Antiochos declared independence and crowned himself king of Asia Minor. Thus, negotiations with Ptolemy were in order for Seleucus to try and control the wayward dominions of Anatolia. The treaty secured the borders of the ceasefire. Seleucia in Perea had been retained by the Ptolemies, while the parts of northern Syria that had been recovered were retained by Seleucus II. With the end of the war, the internal politics of the Seleucid Empire continued to be unstable. Seleucus II fought against his brother Antiochos Hyrax in the War of the Brothers, and lost the Battle of Ancyra in 239 BCE. In the east, the first incursion of the Parthians was going remarkably well, and they were overrunning Iran. Seleucus moved eastwards to stop them, while Antiochos continued to fight against regional kings for control of Asia Minor, like the newly minted Attalid dynasty. This failed spectacularly, and he left for refuge in Armenia. His dreams of winning back the throne in Syria were crushed in 226 BCE, when he died in Thrace. Seleucus managed to repel the Parthians and hoped to do the same in Asia Minor against the Attalids. This, however, did not come to pass, as he died in 255 BCE. In his place, his son Seleucus III, and then another son called Antiochus III, rose to the throne, determined to achieve victory. He initiated military operations and managed by 221 BCE to regain control over Media and Persia and defeat the rebellious governors. In Ptolemaic Egypt, things were starting to not go smoothly. While the empire was doing well, local revolts emerged in the 240s BCE, and Egypt was involved in wars in Greece. Ptolemy's death in 221 BCE brought forth a weaker ruler, Ptolemy IV. The first couple of years of his reign were full of court intrigue between his family members, resulting in his mother, Berenike, being murdered, his sister, Arsinoe II, marrying him, and Greek nobles influencing him. This was an opportunity for Antiochos, who had neutralized his own enemies in court early on in his reign. He prepared carefully for war, but his initial attempts in 221 BCE did not come to fruition, as the local generals managed to push him off. 2 years later, however, the local generals, like the Aetolian Theodotos and Panetolos, felt distant from the unstable Egyptian courts. Thus, in 219 BCE, they allowed Antiochos to enter Phoenicia, and he managed to take northern Syria under Seleucid control. After this, Antiochos tried to solidify control over the region before moving forward. A momentary truce allowed both sides to regroup, but Antiochos was bound to attack after the winter of 219 BCE. One of Ptolemy's courtier puppeteers, Sosibios, began a bold new recruiting tactic. He began to recruit both Greek and native Egyptian phalangites, breaking a previous norm of ethnic segregation. This empowered the Ptolemaic army, because many of the northern generals had deserted to Antiochos' side. The latter moved into the southern territories in 217 BCE and began to march towards Gaza. The Ptolemies rose to the challenge, and the debts were to be settled in the Battle of Raphia or Rafah in 217 BCE. The battle took place on June 22, 217 BCE, and our source Polybius provides it in some detail. The Ptolemaic force included 75,000 infantry of both Greeks and Egyptians, as well as Libyans and other ethnicities, alongside 5,000 cavalry and 73 African war elephants. The Seleucids included 62,000 infantry of Greeks, Arabians and other ethnicities, 6,000 cavalry and 102 Asian war elephants. This was the first engagement where African and Asian war elephants faced each other in battle. The first days of the battle involved sporadic conflict. Eventually, on the fifth day, the armies began to march forward. The phalanxes were at the center. The Ptolemaic cavalry was on the left, opposite the Seleucid cavalry. The light mercenaries were on the other side, on the right flank, opposite the Seleucid mercenaries. The elephants had been placed at the front, and the two pachyderm lines marched towards each other first. Eventually, the African elephants saw their Indian cousins were far larger than them and began to panic. This caused chaos in the front row, and then Antiochos' cavalry moved forward against Ptolemy's. The chaos caused by the elephants forced Ptolemy's cavalry into retreat. Ptolemy's right flank was in a better position. The commander, Echecrates, ordered an attack and pushed through the enemy, managing to break the Seleucid flank. At the same time, Ptolemy IV moved to the center, where his Egyptian and Macedonian phalanxes had been placed, and rallied them forward. They crashed into the Seleucid phalanxes and silver shields, and the battle in the center continued in close quarters combat. Antiochos was busy fighting off the Ptolemaic cavalry and managed to succeed in this endeavor. However, he then turned away and saw that Ptolemy's phalanxes had succeeded in pushing off his own phalanxes. He dashed back to try to regroup the phalanx, but it was too late. His troops had fled back to the north. The battle had been a success for the Ptolemies, as Antiochos took refuge alongside his troops in the city of Gaza. He negotiated a truce that solidified the front line. The south of Coeli Syria was left to the Ptolemies, while he retained control of the north. The Fourth Syrian War had been yet another stalemate, with many victories for the Seleucids, but ultimately a defeat in the final push. Despite their success in fending off the Seleucids, the Ptolemies were growing ever more unstable. While Antiochos went off to deal with revolts by separatist generals like Achaeos, Ptolemy IV left his courtier puppet masters like the noble Sosibios to sort out the game of politics. The Ptolemies did try to help some anti-Seleucid separatists like Achaeos and continued to be involved in conflicts in the Aegean, but things were brewing in the kingdom itself. Besides animosity between Greek and Egyptian subjects, which Ptolemaic efforts like calling themselves pharaohs for the first time after Raphia tried to cease, the unusual court intrigue continued. A revolt even took place in Upper Egypt, where the lowest number of Greek settlers lived, and it was filled with nativist rage against Hellenic colonial presence. With the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BCE, the court factions exploded into conflict once more. Sosibios and another regent called Agathocles murdered Ptolemy's wife Arsinoe and then held the regency while Greco-Egyptian relations deteriorated. The regents hoped to maintain their control by paying the Egyptian priestly elites, but peasants and citizens subject to heavy taxation eventually revolted. Agathocles was lynched in Alexandria. The chaos allowed for a perfect opportunity for Antiochos to invade Coele-Syria once more. He called on his ally Philip of the Antigonids in Macedon to invade Asia Minor. The Macedonian obliged, and the wheels for the Second Macedonian War began to unwind, which we have covered in another video. On the Oriental front, Antiochos initiated his invasion in 202 BCE. His fortified cities in the north provided an excellent way forward. Thus, he powered down south and took Damascus, before moving down south towards Palestine. He ended up being delayed in Gaza as he besieged the city until 201 BCE, but eventually he took it and moved down southwest as the Ptolemies scrambled to subdue the southern rebellion. Things boiled over in 200 BCE when a mercenary general of the Ptolemies, Scopas of Aetolia, faced the Seleucid Antiochos in the Battle of Panium. The Seleucid troops in Panium were once more led by Antiochos III and his young son Antiochos the Younger. They commanded 70,000 men as well as elephants. Opposing them was a 4-kilometer-long line of 46,500 to 53,000 men under Scopas, both infantry and cavalry. The enemy troops were divided by a stream in the center of the river. Before the battle, Antiochos the Younger took his elite cavalry unit, the Cataphracts, during the night and took a hilltop fort in Mount Hermon. The next day, the battle commenced, and said Cataphracts managed to rout the Ptolemaic cavalry. In the center, Scopas and the Aetolians proved their skills in battle by pushing off the Seleucid forces. However, the Seleucids were both numerically superior and had a better arsenal. The Seleucid elephants fought their Ptolemaic enemies in the north, and once more, Indian prevailed against the African pachyderm. Then both the Cataphracts and the elephants turned towards the center. They surrounded the Aetolians, and thousands of them perished on the spot, though numbers range from 17,500 to 20,000 phalanx soldiers. Scopas was on the right flank and fled with his cavalry to Sidon, where they remained under siege until their surrender in 198 BCE. The Seleucids weighed their options after this victory. They could have invaded Egypt, but they received envoys from the rising power of Rome urging them not to do this due to the grain disruptions it could cause. Thus, they focused their efforts on raiding and capturing Asia Minor territories controlled by the Egyptians. The Ptolemies, by 195 BCE, were eager for peace, which was achieved after a marriage alliance between Ptolemy V, the heir who had risen to the throne after his father's death, and the Seleucid princess Cleopatra I. Thus, the Ptolemies lost Coele-Syria and returned to focusing on the Egyptian revolt, which was now run by priestly elites and had taken a nativist element. Despite their victory, the Seleucids soon faced a twin threat: the Romans, who defeated them and forced them to sign a treaty in Apamea in 188 BCE, and the resurgent march of the Parthians in the east. The Ptolemies fought the wayward nativist kingdom in the south until 185 BCE, when they managed to reconquer the territories. Antiochos IV Epiphanes succeeded his brother in 175 BCE, while Ptolemy V died in 180 BCE. Cleopatra tried to keep the peace in Egypt and avoid any overtures to reclaim Coele-Syria, something her husband had wished to do before he died. However, when she died in 176 BCE, her son Ptolemy VI was under the influence of local courtiers. Slowly, war began once more in 170 BCE, but we know little of what transpired to cause it. The Seleucids managed to take the gateway to Egypt, Pelusium, and Antiochos went as far west as Naucratis and dangerously close to Alexandria. The unrest in Egypt erupted once more, and the courtiers who controlled Ptolemy, Euleos and Lennios, were killed, and in their place came Cineas and Komnenos. It seemed that Egypt was partially occupied, and that Antiochus tried to impose a certain Ptolemy Physcon, brother of the ruling Ptolemy, as client king. However, trouble in Phoenicia led to Antiochus' withdrawal, and this led to the two brothers tagging together against him. Antiochus returned, took Cyprus, managed to retake Memphis, and even tried to besiege Alexandria once more. However, the Roman Eagle would not tolerate an empire in the east growing too powerful. They issued an ultimatum to Antiochus via a certain Popilius Linnaeus, who told him to relinquish all he had conquered in the 6th Syrian War and to allow the Ptolemies to stay independent. Fearful of Rome, who had just won the Battle of Pydna, Antiochus relented in what came to be known as the Day of Eleusis. In 168 BCE, the war officially ended. Both Egypt and Syria would face regionalist revolts after. the Maccabean revolt for the Seleucids, and a revolt by Dionysios Petroserapis for the Ptolemies. This 6th Syrian War is technically the last one. The scholar John D. Granger also included 3 more wars in the Seleucid dynastic wars, during which the Ptolemies sent troops to assist one side. However, as those are technically another conflict altogether, and as they overlap with the Roman wars of conquest of the East in the 2nd century BCE, they are not discussed here. Likewise, we'll leave out various Ptolemaic civil wars and revolts by natives, because they involve a different political background from the one that caused the Syrian Wars or the Wars of the Diadochi. War would continue in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the states that had been forged at the start of the Wars of the Diadochi were now very different. The long aftermath of the Wars of the Diadochi was finally over, and the Hellenistic Age had reached its zenith. As the wars have now ended, let us take stock of the geopolitical landscape the Diadochi left in their wake. The Ptolemies in Egypt were very much consolidated, and had begun their grand project of building a Greek-centered rule over the proud Egyptian people. They slowly built Greek settlements and expanded the city of Alexandria, becoming a naval Silk Road hub. They used Hellenic culture as a quasi-colonial force upon Egypt, but slowly took up more Egyptian characteristics. They fought many wars over Phoenicia and Judea with the Seleucids, and tried to control Cyrene to their west, which lasted until the Battle of Actium. Meanwhile, the Lysimachian heir, Ptolemy Epigonos, tried to claim the Macedonian throne, but failed, ending up in Egypt. His kingdom was split between Macedonian and Seleucid dynasties, as well as small statelets like the Thracian kingdom of Bithynia. The biggest of these, the Attalids in Pergamon, became a wealthy cultural hub. The rest of Asia Minor became a battleground between the Kingdom of Pontus, run by Greco-Iranian dynasties like that of Mithridates the Great, who was famous for fighting the Roman general Pompey, and other small statelets that emerged, like the Kingdom of Commagene, which also merged Greek and Persian religions. Over in the Greek mainland, the Antigonids ruled over Macedon, and had various phases of oscillating control over the rest of Hellas in various wars. In the century after the Diadochi Wars ended, the Roman Republic slowly appeared in the region, and eventually overtook and annexed Hellas. As for the Seleucids, they built a massive empire over the Near East and Persia, and constructed local social networks with local elites to keep control over that vast land. Slowly, and in wars with Scythians and Parthians, Persia came under the control of the Parthian dynasty or other local rulers. In the Far East, one of the satraps of the Seleucids, Diadotos I, broke off and founded the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The history of this kingdom, mostly known through coinage, is known for both wars with nomadic tribes, but also for prosperity, and cities like Iconium, where Greek and Persian architecture merged in elite houses. The southern part of the Greco-Bactrians broke off in the 2nd century BCE. It formed the first of many Indo-Greek kingdoms, which ruled over Taxila, where Porus once ruled, and even fought wars with Indian empires like the Shunga. All of the easternmost Hellenic kingdoms merged Indian, Greek and Persian cultures, and were eventually overrun by the Indo-Scythians, Indo-Parthians and Kushans. Ultimately, the Hellenistic era, which began with the Wars of the Diadochi, continued until the conquest of Greece by Rome. Alexander's last words, "to the strongest," ended up causing 40 years of fragmentation and titanic clashes. It was an era of colonial tensions, where Greeks ruled over many foreign peoples. However, it was also an era of cosmopolitanism, where Greeks and foreign peoples mingled and made hybrid innovations in philosophy and culture. This era lasted as long as the wars had, with constant conflict and crumbling empires. And yet, it also included the glories of the cities of Alexandria and Antioch, of Taxila and Iconium, without which some of the most important developments in Eurasia would not have occurred, from Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity to Stoicism and Epicureanism. This was an age of beauty, cosmopolitan mixing, and cultural production, which is best summarized by the Persian Timurid poet Hafiz, who, living in a similarly cosmopolitan world, says in his poem, A New World, "As dust, O west wind, let us rise to the heavens, floating free in Creator's glow of elation. If mind desires to return while heart cries to stay, here's a quarrel for love's deliberation. Alas, these words and songs go for naught in this land. Come, Hafez, let's create a new generation. More videos on the history of ancient Greece are on the way. To make sure that you don't miss them, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would not be possible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.